Well, good morning. I'm really happy to see you all here this morning. I hope you had a good time last night. I certainly did. I was complaining, however, I didn't have enough lies to tell about some people. I'm still working on that, and there's a chance that I might be able to stick it to a couple people later on. Uh, anyway, we're here today, and the last Monarch meeting of this sort, where the public was engaged as, and I call you the public rather than a bunch of scientists, was in 2001 here on this campus, over another part of the campus. And that was more of a research meeting, and a book was published based on the talks that were held in that particular meeting. We won't be holding or creating a book from the talks here. This is really a kind of a mini symposium, and we have veteran scientists as well as new scientists on the field, in the field of working with monarchs that you will be hearing from today. My intention today is in part to really emphasize the importance of research. You know, monarchs are really in a delicate condition right now. The population is going down. This is going to be a very bad migration this year. The population is going to be low. It's going to probably be the lowest population in 5 or 6 years, maybe even longer than that, by the time everything settles out in Mexico. This is of concern because in 2024, the Fish and Wildlife Department will be making a decision as to whether or not to declare the monarchs endangered and subject to all of the provisions of the Endangered Species Act. That would change a lot of dynamics, and we're going to be talking about the pros and cons of that later on in this particular meeting. But, you know, to make a decision of any kind with regard to management of wildlife, we need good science. And the condition of the monarch population has inspired a tremendous volume of literature on all sorts of subjects that deal with monarch biology, and that includes the plants. So one of the things that has been happening is that people have been paying a little bit more attention to the literature, and Monarch Joint Venture in particular has put together a team to look at this literature, to compile all of the literature, and to review it. And in your packet today, you will find all of the literature that they assembled for 2021 reviewed, and it's a long thing. They had something like 32 or 33 pages of material there. You know, it's online, but most of you won't read it if it's online, and hopefully some of you will read it because it's right there in front of you, at least at some time. There's a lot of important papers there in that compilation. And there's a lot of important papers that have been published this year. You know, this year there will probably be 50 papers on monarch butterflies. And right now there's something like 42 or 43. I've gone through that list that Monarch Joint Venture put together, and I've selected out about 11 that I think are really important in telling us something about monarch population dynamics, which is a subject that I think we really need to understand. You know, there's an amazing number of things that are going on simultaneously across the planet, and there's very little research that's going on to try to understand what's happening to all of the insects that are declining. We know insects are declining in a lot of places, but we don't know why they're declining. And I see this as a problem in a couple of areas. One, we don't have the physiology of a lot of insects. Two, we don't understand the biochemical interactions between all of the contaminants that are out there and the reproductive systems in these particular forms of biology. And thirdly, we don't have any really good demography. So what we need with monarchs is we need all of those things. We need a really good understanding of their physiology, their reproductive biology, and their demography. We need to know how they're affected by all of the weather conditions and all of the catastrophic conditions that could occur in a season or over several seasons. The data that I've worked with seems to suggest that there are carryover effects from one year to the next. You go into the winter with a really low population with very poor quality butterflies, and you start out the next year with a substandard population of founders. One of the things I've been kind of explaining to people the last couple of days is that every population out there, whether you're talking about monarch butterflies or anything else, has to have a good start. And that has to be followed up by good conditions. And what we saw this year is that monarch butterflies got off to an average start, and then they ran into some really bad conditions in the late in the second week of May, then in the third week of May, fourth week of May, and then the first week of June. And that was when the first generation was attempting to make a reproductive rush as it reached north of 40. The failure of that reproductive effort at that particular time doomed the population for the rest of the year, with a lot of people not seeing any significant number of monarchs until very late in the season. There's simply no way to catch up after a bad start. And so this is what we're dealing with this year. Now, the good news is that we brought you here at the time when the peak migration is here. And so if you're with us tomorrow and you can swing a net, there's a good chance that you can catch and tag a butterfly. And this tagging program has shown us a lot about the dynamics of the migration. A lot of that hasn't been published, but will be published fairly soon. We've got a number of papers in the works. But this ability to tag these monarchs and get a large number of recoveries in Mexico has been instrumental in really kind of opening up what we know about the dynamics of this migration, because it tells us not only about the migration itself, but it tells us what's going to happen in the next year. So what we're working on is a model, and hopefully we can get this out soon, which allows us to predict what's going to happen to the population 4 or 5 months ahead of time, maybe even longer than that. So I want you to pay attention to the research. This is why, in part, why we brought you here. We want you to become well-informed. One of the things that's been very encouraging to me in my journey with Monarch Watch has been, to manage Dplex, our discussion list. And to see that discussion list go from a lot of really kind of naive discussions to relatively informed posts where people are really knowledgeable and they know a lot about this butterfly and can inform the newbies, what they need to know to advance whatever their cause is. So, I feel that having an educated public is really important here, and this is what we're trying to do. I wish this was a longer symposium, and I wish it involved more speakers, but we do have some excellent speakers for today, and I think you'll be interested in their particular topics.
Well, yeah, my name's Anurag Agrawal. I'm really sorry I can't be there today, but I'm teaching field ecology in an hour here in Ithaca, New York. And happy to share with you a brief research presentation on the interactions between monarchs, milkweed, and some other critters. My website is listed here, and it sounds like the presentation will be posted, which is wonderful. I want to just start off by acknowledging the tremendous work that citizen scientists have done in the cause of understanding monarch biology and conservation, at least since the 1940s, spearheaded by Nora and Fred Urquhart, and picked up in 1992 by Monarch Watch. And I guess I just have a big thanks and congratulations to Chip for leading Monarch Watch's efforts and for securing, it sounds like, a long-term future for citizen scientists to engage in many aspects of monarch biology. I have two simple messages for you today in terms of thinking about really monarch biology. And they're simply, let's not forget that this is a battle. And by this, I mean the interaction between monarchs and their only food plant, the milkweed. And the other message is that there is more to life than the monarch. I love the monarch. I also love the queen, but there are many insects associated with milkweed, and I'll talk a little bit about those today. Sometimes I get calls or emails from people wanting to kill the other native interesting insects on milkweed, and of course my reaction is, they all have a place and a right to be there. And in fact, they're teaching us a tremendous amount about the biology of interactions between plants and insects. I would go further and to say that the monarch is I've referred to as a kind of a royal representative of what we all want to do, which is conserve functioning wildlands, and that the conservation of any one species is far less important than the conservation and sustainability of functioning wildlands. And so I think monarchs play a very important role, but we should not be overly focused on them. So to start with the first message, it's just a classic quote by a poet that some of you will know. Nature is red in tooth and claw. And the story for monarchs and milkweeds is no different. You know, in central New York here in Ithaca, when milkweeds emerge in late May and early June from their perennial rootstocks, and monarchs are migrating northward, we sometimes get eggs as early as the first couple weeks of May, but typically in July, early July. And 4 days later, that monarch egg hatches, eats the eggshell, and what ensues is a kind of manifestation of the long-term negative or antagonistic interaction that has occurred between monarchs and milkweeds. So the first thing that a monarch typically does on common milkweed or any hairy species is it mows the lawn. Plants botanically produce these things called trichomes. I sometimes think of it as the kind of sand in your salad. And the monarch, before it sinks its mandibles into the leaves and gets any nutrition out of there, is cutting those hairs and getting them out of the way. I hope you can see my pointer there. And that's to say that in these kinds of interactions, the plants are putting forth a barrier to feeding. That is, they've evolved by natural selection to mount a defense. Given that the milkweed is essentially the only food for the monarch, it has adaptations to circumvent or to deactivate those defenses. So let's say the monarch survives the shaving of the trichomes. Most of you will know that, of course, the next thing that it encounters is the pressurized latex canals that are inside the milkweed leaves that follow the plumbing, the xylem and the phloem, but carry that sticky toxic substance. Well, I found this image in the field almost 20 years ago now. Some very large fraction, depending on the milkweed species, is it 25% or 50%? It depends on the species of milkweed that the monarchs are feeding on. But some large fraction of monarchs die in this way after having had their very first bites of the milkweed, an intact plant that has the pressurized latex. It shaved the lawn, it took its first few bites, was overwhelmed by a droplet of latex and carried it dead to the leaf. Now, this won't be lost on you folks. I mean, the milkweed is the only food for this caterpillar, and yet the plant is doing a remarkably good job of defending itself. Now, as many of you will know, of course, the monarchs, all of them don't die this way, and certainly on plants that have lower latex or that have their canals already severed, survivorship is much higher. And monarchs themselves have behaviors to deactivate the latex and to allow them to feed more profitably. So this first instar monarch has painstakingly cut veins in a small island. It's less than half a centimeter. When I was watching this thing, it's wiping its head as it gets the latex on its head, and it's, taking 25, 30 minutes making this circle, and then we'll feed on that island inside that is free of the latex. Now, the monarchs, when they get larger, in fourth and fifth instar, will make larger cuts to the laticifers, and will spend time deactivating the latex in this way, and then feed on the tissue distal. So in the natural history of this antagonistic interaction, the plant puts forward its trichomes and they get shaved, puts forward the latex and it gets deactivated. And of course, milkweeds are also famous for their toxins. The cardenolides are what's called the cardiac glycosides. And monarchs are not only highly tolerant of those compounds, but as you know, they sequester or pack them into their bodies. And so it would be easy to assume then that the monarch is immune or relatively unaffected by those cardiac glycosides. But I want to share with you just some recent results from our laboratory that relate to the fact that, in fact, monarchs are negatively impacted by cardenolides, and they have to balance the benefits they get from sequestration versus the toxicity. A long-standing result in the literature that was initially championed or demonstrated by Steve Malcolm and Maren Zalucki, we've replicated their results, indicates that monarchs tend to lay eggs, that's what's on the y-axis here, on intermediate concentration milkweed plants. I released, I can't remember, 20 butterflies in a big greenhouse with 200 plants on them. We then estimated the cardenolides in all the plants. And then on average, they lay the most eggs on that intermediate level of toxin. Well, what they're balancing there is the need or benefit of sequestration and the costs associated with getting too much cardenolide in their bodies. What I'm showing you here is that the more cardenolides that monarchs sequester or pack into their bodies, the slower their growth rate. That's what's on the y-axis here. So they ideally sequester around this value 4, but when they feed on plants that are much higher, they sequester more, but their growth rate declines. And we've discovered some of the ways in which milkweeds, actually are actively poisoning the monarch. In this case, we've been studying the tropical milkweed, Asclepias curassavica, which contains high amounts of one cardenolide called vorusharin. It's not sequestered by the monarch, it converts it. So if you look at the monarch tolerance of plant toxins, when they sequester frugicide, one of the cardenolides in tropical milkweed, they have a high tolerance. But when they feed on plants with vorusharin, they have a low tolerance to that compound. What the monarchs do is they convert physiologically in their bodies vorusharin to calotropin, which is less toxic to them. But that conversion and sequestration comes at a cost to them. So the main point I want to make here is that all of us want to help. I want to help. But it's important to be cognizant of the fact that nature in its course, what we're trying to help with is an antagonistic interaction. And in my estimation, we should let nature take its course in terms of the plant herbivore interaction and help in other ways. Now, let's just talk briefly about the more to life than the monarch. So I work on the community of insects that are on milkweeds here in central New York and across the US. There are about 12 species, tremendously diverse insects that bore through the roots like the larvae of Tetraopes, eat the stems like the larvae of Rhizomatus, eat the seeds like Lygeus and Onchopeltis. 3 species of aphids. And in addition to the general message that I would argue we want to conserve all of these species, again, I would argue that what we want to do is create self-sustaining habitats that not only are useful for these species, but the many others that might thrive and contribute to ecosystem functions. On the biology side, I'd simply say that we've been trying to learn some general principles and rules associated with how insects evolve on a toxic host plant. And I'll remind you that there are 135 species of Asclepias or milkweeds, mostly Mexico and northwards. And so there is just tremendous plant diversity. And 12 species on common milkweed here means there are countless other insects that are specialized in only feeding on a species like Asclepias obovata or subulata or tuberosa in other parts of North America, let alone other parts of the world on related Apocynaceae. I'm going to skip this just in the interest of time, and I'll simply end with kind of some of the things we're learning. Milkweed insects are nearly all specialists. They're nearly all aposematic, that is brightly colored, advertising their toxicity. But they have really different adaptations and relationships with milkweed's toxins. And that's something we're using right now to try to understand some general principles. Monarchs and seed predators on Capeltis basically follow the general pattern of having the same genetic substitutions, sequestration of toxins, and advertising that toxicity. But when we start looking at the moths, really interesting differences appear. Neither of them have the genetic substitutions to tolerate the cardenolides. Cycnia sequesters, but Eucades doesn't. And Cycnia appears to be not aposomatic, whereas Eucades is. The same kind of variation appears among the beetles and among the flies. And I'm going to end here, but simply say that there's a lot to be learned and studied by studying the diversity of organisms on this host plant. Hey, thanks a lot for your attention.
So hi, everyone. My name is Patrick Guerra, and I'm at the Department of Biological Sciences at the University of Cincinnati. So today, I'm briefly going to talk about the work that we're doing, trying to understand how urbanization affects the migratory biology of monarchs. So just quickly to talk about, first, I'm going to briefly go over the monarch migratory cycle and how monarchs can actually orient during their long distance migration. Then I'm going to focus on urbanization and how it creates different forms of sensory pollution, which can affect the ability of monarchs to migrate when they're using these sensory-based compass mechanisms. And one of the things that we've been focusing on recently is nighttime light pollution. And after talking about nighttime light pollution, I'll then talk about other anthropogenic threats caused by urbanization, perturbing monarch butterfly migratory behavior. So if you just look at here's a map of the monarch migration. I'm pretty sure everyone's pretty familiar with it, but monarchs throughout their migration, if you just look at the Eastern North American population, they basically go through a lot of cities. And for example, just look at the red oval, that kind of represents the summer monarchs. They go through a lot of urbanized areas, and even their offspring represented in the yellow, which are the fall monarchs. And as they, if you follow that black line all the way to Mexico, they encounter a lot of urban buildup, especially on the East Coast. Even when they're in Mexico, there is some level of urbanization. And finally, when they leave and they go back northwards to recolonize the rest of North America, they really do, again, encompass or interact with a lot of urbanization. So you can see this urbanization is something that every population, whether it's summer, fall, overwintering, migrant in spring, it's something that all monarchs will encounter during the entire process of their migratory cycle. So in terms of trying to understand how urbanization can affect migratory biology, we focus on how urbanization might affect the ability of monarchs as they're orienting and navigating during migration. So we focus on the fall monarch population. So here, basically, we study the primary mechanism of orientation for monarchs, which is their time-compensated sun compass. So as most of you know, monarchs can use the sun as a visual cue in order to keep orienting southwards throughout the day. So in the morning, if they want to fly southwards, monarchs keep the sun to their left. But the thing is, it looks like the sun is actually moving across the horizon. So the monarchs can't stick to that first rule of keeping the sun to the left. So we affectionately call these rules of Flight Club, and we're happy to talk about it. So by noon, when the sun is at its zenith, monarchs have to have a second rule where instead of keeping the sun to their left, they fly towards the sun. And finally, in the afternoon, when the sun is starting to set in the west, monarchs have to have a third rule, they keep the sun to the right. So in this way, monarchs have these kind of instructions or these rules in order to keep the sun in their visual field to keep flying in the proper southwards direction throughout the migratory cycle when they're going, for example, from Canada, upper United States, all the way to Mexico. But the interesting thing, though, even though they can use the sun as a visual cue to keep orienting southwards, how do they know what time of day it is? So what they've been able to do is use their internal circadian clock. And the circadian clocks are actually found in their antennae. They use the time information in order to approximate the day. So they use the visual cue of the sun and the time of day trained to in their antennal clock, in their circadian, this is a molecular mechanism, they know what to do in the morning, afternoon. So given the fact that the orientation mechanism is very clock-based, very influenced by their circadian clock, we were thinking about what about cities might be perturbing this kind of mechanism. So one really clear example of something from cities that might be perturbing the circadian clock is nighttime light pollution, specifically nighttime light pollution induced by urbanization. And if you look at the map at night, you can clearly see, if you look at, you can see my cursor, maybe if you just even focus just on the Eastern North American population, while they're migrating southwards, they really encounter lots of nighttime pollution or when they're venturing southwards. So in order to study this, we took monarchs who were migrating during the fall, and we did indoor flight simulator trials. And if you see this, if you can kind of like the little cartoon over here, you're familiar with the flight simulator, but it's basically a treadmill. You can assess how the butterflies are trying to orient while they're flying fictively in a stationary position. It's kind of like a little where when they're turning, how they're trying to fly in what direction while you're testing them. And we had to do these trials indoors because it was the best way to isolate the effects of nighttime light pollution. Because if you were to do these trials outdoors, you wouldn't be able to control other things that might be happening at night that are different from the day, like differences in temperature or differences in sound or different wind patterns. So I'm just going to kind of go through and summarize what are the results we found when we subjected monarchs to nighttime light pollution in the lab in these kind of flight simulator trials. So what we did was we monarchs with basically a shop light. This is something you can find at Lowe's or Home Depot or any hardware store. And it's something you can find outdoors when people are either doing construction at night or it's under porch. It's basically an ubiquitous type of light source. It's nowhere near as strong as the sun, but it's full spectrum. And basically what we found is that when we took monarchs inside and in a dark room, and you tested monarchs with its light source during their day, and this was the only source of light used to orient southwards during, as if they're flying outdoors, monarchs treated as artificial light equivalent to the sun. So they treat artificial light just like the sun. And this happens both during the day and night. So monarchs are flying normally, even though they're inside a room, as if it was outside with this artificial source. And what we showed that is when you actually took monarchs who were at rest, so we kept them in these incubators, so they're basically in full and complete dark. When you remove them and you quickly put them in a flight simulator to assess what happens and you turn a light on, the monarchs instantly wake up and they fly in the appropriate southwards direction. So at this time when monarchs should be quiescent, like for example, outdoors, they're just resting or roosting on the tree, the moment you turn the light on, they actively fly as if it was during the day. And basically what happens, basically the light that we subject the monarchs to is actually perturbing the circadian clock. So remember, if you remember, monarchs have to use the sun as a visual cue to keep orienting southwards throughout the day, but they use their circadian clock to know what time of day it is, to know where to put their field of view, where to put the sun in their field of view. And what happens is that, for example, if you shine the light on monarchs and test them in their early evening, like the first few hours of darkness, what happens is that we cause an actual, something called a phase delay in the behavior of the monarchs, where when you test them, they actually fly at the afternoon, even though it's pitch black when they're already asleep or resting, they actively fly in the afternoon where they keep the sun to the left. But if you shine the light on them at different points of their night cycle, either in the middle of the night or closer to when it's going to be sunrise, you do something to them, to the circadian clock called phase advance, where the monarch, instead of thinking it's still the last day or the afternoon, they think it's the next day. So the morning's actually been accelerated. They actually think the next day happens almost 6-7 hours earlier than it should. And what happens is basically their clock is being perturbed. So you can actually make them think it's still daytime, even though it's night, or they think it's already the new day, even though it's still night. And what's been shown is that this kind of phase delay and phase advance in other systems, other animals, even humans, is that messing up with the circadian clock causes a lot of disorders. For example, metabolic disorders. There are also higher incidences of cancer due to perturbing the clock with nighttime light pollution. So essentially what happens is monarchs at night, we almost are like inducing into them jet lag. They're basically have a messed up or a perturbed circadian clock, which affects their ability to know when it's supposed to be the right time to fly. So basically what happens is we've prematurely aroused the monarchs. They should be at rest. So we've shortened their days or made them think that it's the next day is much earlier. So what happens though? Does this really happen in the field? Because what we've been doing are these indoor experiments. What happens is that most often this type of nighttime light pollution, they're going to be exposed to this while they're roosting at night. So here are just kind of like figures. And if you can kind of see these little blue dots in the little diagrams, those represent roosts. And then the kind of color around them that's different from the black background, that's the amount of nighttime light pollution that that roost is in. So basically, the roosts are small, where, for example, if you look at this kind of these numbers, whether it's only like low light pollution or even lots of roosts are being found in these conditions where monarchs are being exposed to these type of nighttime light pollution circumstances at night. And what's interesting, when people thought of nighttime light pollution in terms of migratory animals, they've always only focused on nocturnal migrants, moths, because that was kind of like, well, what happens when they're migrating at night? They're going to be exposed to light that they shouldn't be. And there was little work on diurnal migrants like monarchs, who actually only migrate during the day and should be at rest at night. But our data show that when you expose them to nighttime light pollution, you can kind of prematurely arouse them and make them fly as it was the daytime. So that's kind of that urbanization actually produces kind of this nighttime light pollution, this sensory pollution that actually perturbs their ability to migrate properly because they start flying at the wrong time of day. So the current work that we're looking at now is, how does urbanization affect other ways that monarchs might be migrating? So for example, our group showed that monarchs have an inclination-based magnetic. So during the day when it's overcast and monarchs can't see the sun, they rely on a backup mechanism. They can use the magnetic field of the earth to know which way to fly northwards and which way to fly southwards. But cities actually produce a lot of electromagnetic noise interference that can actually perturb the ability of use magnetic fields or when they're sensing. For example, it's been shown previously that birds can be perturbed when they sense these electromagnetic fields when they're trying to use a magnetic compass. So this is the next thing we're trying to see what cities do in terms of other compass mechanisms. And finally, we also showed that temperature is something that actually can calibrate the monarch sun compass. So for example, monarchs, when they're overwintering in Mexico, they rely on sensing cold for that requisite kind of cold period to know which way to fly northwards or southwards. So in the fall, their compass is tuned southwards, but once they overwinter and experience a cold temperature in Mexico, their actual sun compass is actually recalibrated to go northwards. So that kind of leads to the question, so what happens to these types of signals, these temperature signals that monarchs are sensitive to, especially with cities and with climate change, where cities are just these kind of heat islands. And if you couple that with the urban heat island effect, there could be these kind of detrimental effects on the compass mechanisms, which are sensitive to temperature. So I just want to quickly wrap up and thank the people who did this work. So the work that you saw with the nighttime light pollution I summarized was done by my former postdoc, Adam Harlan, my former grad student, Sam Stratton. And we wouldn't have been able to do this work without access to the resources at the University of Cincinnati Center for Field Studies, namely the rural work, plus the city of Cincinnati was able to support our work. We were able to do our nighttime experiments at the Wolf Planetarium and kind of freely tromp around the city of Cincinnati. And finally, Journey North has been a great resource for data. Thanks.
Hi, everybody. I'm John Pleasance. Sorry I can't be there in person. Okay, so what I'm going to be talking about today are what tagging, some of you have been involved with tagging, and what can this tell us about the factors affecting migration success? And first of all, I want to acknowledge that to get to the results that I'm going to be talking about today, it takes a village. It takes villagers who are citizen science taggers. It takes villagers who are local people in Mexico who retrieve tagged butterflies. It takes a village chief. That's Chip Taylor. It takes a whole bunch of people in support capacity to get the data, to analyze the data, to put it in a format that can be sorted. And it also takes some villagers that are involved in other projects like the Monarch Larva Monitoring Project to tell us about eggs and larvae on milkweeds in the field, and people who are telling us what the parasite load of monarchs is, to provide some corroborative information as we try to sort some of these things out. Let's see. So let me first just kind of remind you of the migration pathways here. There are butterflies that use this central flyway. That's probably the majority of monarchs that migrate to Mexico. But then there are also butterflies that use this eastern flyway. And that flyway is really determined by the Appalachian Mountains that you can see here, which sort of serve as an impediment. So monarchs that are born on the East Coast then take this eastern flyway to get down to Mexico. And that'll be important as we move on here. So let's take a look at the village of taggers. So this map shows you the location of people who tag butterflies. There are roughly 10,000 people that tag butterflies. 250,000 tags are distributed each year. From 1998 to 2015, 1.4 million butterflies were tagged and about 14,000 tags were recovered. So what you can see here is that there are taggers located really throughout the whole migratory range. There's some areas that are heavier than others. It'd be nice to fill in some of those lighter areas, but they're virtually taggers everywhere. When we get to the other end of the line in Mexico, we rely on people there to retrieve butterflies that are tagged, and they don't do that from butterflies that are hanging up in the trees in clusters. They look at butterflies that are on the ground that have died for a variety of reasons, and they find tagged butterflies and record that information. Or somebody comes and picks up the tags and that information is recorded. And just to give you some appreciation for what's involved in finding these tagged butterflies, Chip once decided to see how hard it was to do this and collected a huge pile of dead butterflies, looked through, it turns out 40,000 butterflies, 2 tags. So, so this is hard work. The local people who find butterflies with tags, they're rewarded $5 per tag, but it's still hard work, and we couldn't do this without their hard work. So let's see what we've got. So I'm going to talk about the period from 2004 to 2015. This is the reason for starting at 2004 is because at that point, taggers were explicitly asked, were you tagging a wild-caught butterfly or were you tagging a butterfly that you had raised? And we stopped at 2015 here because that's sort of the last point where we've pulled all this information together. So what I'm going to be talking about at this point is just wild-caught butterflies. I will say something at the end about reared butterflies that were tagged. So what you see here, what we've done is taken the whole migratory range here and divided it up into sectors, 5 by 5, latitude, longitude, and that these little numbers, the red numbers at the top here, just tell you are the sector numbers. And then what you see in black here is the number of tagged butterflies between 2004 and 2015. So there are a few things to notice here. There's some sectors like sector 13 that just has a lot of tagged butterflies over this period. The blue number, I should point out, is the number of tagged butterflies that were retrieved in Mexico. So yes, there are some sectors that have a lot more tagged butterflies than others. Be nice to even that out a little bit. But one of the things you'll notice if you just look at the blue numbers here, the number of tagged butterflies that were found in Mexico, is every sector virtually has some butterfly that was found in Mexico. Even these ones up here in New Brunswick, Canada, which is probably more than 3,000 miles away from the overwintering sites down here in Mexico. So that's one thing to notice. So we can look at the migration success of butterflies in each of these sectors, and that's what's on the next slide here. So I've only looked at some of the sectors that have a sufficient number of tagged butterflies to make this meaningful. And so the black numbers that you see here is the tag recovery rate, which we say is tells us something about migration success. So what you see here in general is that about maybe 1 to 1.5% of tagged butterflies are actually recovered in Mexico. Now, it's important to note that that doesn't mean that a butterfly has only a 1% chance of making it to Mexico. These are, remember, the tagged butterflies that are retrieved from dead butterflies, and there are plenty of tagged butterflies that are still up in the trees. We don't know how many those are. So these numbers here don't represent sort of the absolute migration success, but relative migration success, so we can look at a variety of factors that might influence it. So here's one thing to notice. So if we take this swath, this latitudinal swath from west to east, and look at the migration success we can see that it goes down pretty sharply. And if we look at this swath, same sort of factor. And that seems reasonable. The butterflies that are way over here have to travel a lot farther to get down to Mexico than the ones that are tagged, say, the ones you're going to tag in Kansas tomorrow. So to look at sort of the effect that distance has on migration success, we looked at each sector and looked at the average migration success and at the average distance of butterflies tagged there, not to Mexico down here, but to this place here in Del Rio, Texas, where a lot of migrating monarchs are funneled into Mexico, and actually where a lot of human migrants are funneled into the United States. So here's what it looks like if we look at, for each sector, here's each of the sectors. And so for each sector, we look at its migration success, and then we look at the distance between that particular sector and Del Rio. And you can see there's a pretty linear relationship between the two. Now, there are a couple of sectors here, 25 and 17, that are, the migration success is a lot lower than you would expect from this regression line. So let's take a look at those two sectors. Those two sectors, 25 and 17, are butterflies that take this eastern flyway. So this blue line here kind of demarks an area where you take the eastern flyway to the right, and to the west, you'd be using the central flyway. So there's something about taking this eastern flyway that, yeah, you've got to go a lot farther, but your migration success is even lower than you'd expect from distance alone. So there's something going on with the eastern flyway. And there are a couple things here too. One is Gail Steffi noted a while back that butterflies that take this eastern flyway, if they take the inland flyway more along the base of the Appalachians, they do better than if they take the coastal flyway. And we found that was the case as well. So I don't have time now to talk about, why it might be that taking the eastern flyway leads to lower migration success, but we could talk about that later if you want. The other thing that you note when you do this from 2004 to 2015, we see that the average recovery rate, average tag recovery rate, or migration success, we would say, varies over the years. Some year 2008 it was high, 2015 very high. So what's going on here? What are the reasons why some years seem to have higher success than others? Well, let me first of all talk about this particular year, 2015. The thing to remember, of course, is that what we're looking at here is the tag recovery rate. And in 2015, the 2015 population, remember, is in Mexico through the fall and winter of 2015, and then into the spring of 2016. And it turns out in March of 2016, about 3 weeks after I was actually there was a winter storm that killed a lot of butterflies. So the reason that the tag recovery rate is so high for the 2015 population is simply there were a lot more dead butterflies for people to find tags for. But for the other years, we can attribute the variation in tag recovery rate to things associated with migration success. So for example, you can look at the greenness of Texas as determined by some satellite imagery. And Texas is a very important area for nectaring as they migrate down. And so the greener Texas is, the more healthy nectar plants there are, and migration success is higher. There's a parasite that some of you may know about called OE. And if population levels of this parasite are high, we find poor migration success. And if the migration as a whole is late for a variety of reasons, perhaps because of encountering senescing nectar plants or colder temperatures, late migrations also lead to lower migration success. Now, I mentioned at the beginning that beginning in 2004, we asked people to indicate whether they were tagging a reared butterfly or a wild-caught butterfly. And so we can compare migration success for those two by sector. And so what you see here in the black numbers, those are the numbers you saw before for migration success of wild-caught butterflies. And the numbers in blue underneath are the migration success for reared butterflies. And what you can see is that in every case, reared butterflies have much lower migration success than wild-caught. And in general, the success rate for reared is about 50% lower than that for wild-caught. Again, we don't have time to talk about the possible reasons for that, but it does raise the question. We know a lot of people, and maybe a lot of you there, have reared monarch butterflies. You go out to a milkweed patch and you bring in an egg or a caterpillar and you rear it out. And given that the reared monarchs have a 50% lower migration success, you have to ask, well, am I helping this individual butterfly or not by doing this? So this will depend on the survivorship relative to migration success. So if you bring in a caterpillar, obviously the survivorship of that caterpillar is going to be higher than if you left it out in the field, but it's going to have a 50% lower migration success. So is it a good thing to have brought this thing at all? Well, the answer to that really depends on what life stage you bring in. So what this graph shows, it's comparing the chances of making it to Mexico for a wild-caught butterfly and a reared butterfly. And so it combines survivorship with migration success. So we know that reared butterflies are going to have higher survivorship, but lower migration success. And so how do those two things play out against each other? So the line that you see here that says 1, that is when the probability of making it to Mexico is the same for wild-caught and for reared. So if you bring an egg in, because there's such tremendous mortality in the field on eggs, bringing an egg in, the chances of that butterfly that comes out and making it to Mexico is 25 times higher than for if you'd left it in the field. And the same is true for some of the early instars here as well. If you get to the instar 3 and 4, it's kind of a wash. You actually get to, if you bring in an L5 caterpillar, actually its chances of making it to Mexico are lower than if you just left it out in the field. So let me just talk about some future directions. First of all, keep tagging. We've discovered a lot of things with the tagging that's been done already, but there are many more mysteries to be solved. And in particular, this is going to provide a long-term record of the effects of climate change. So don't stop tagging because we know some of the answers. The other thing is, as far as rearing is concerned, I'm not all that concerned about it. Do it for fun, do it for education. And in fact, as soon as Chip is finished with dealing with this 30th anniversary event, I'm going to talk to him about a project where we try to determine why reared butterflies have lower migration success. And that's my license plate there. So thanks for listening.
Kelsey is up next. This is Kelsey Fisher. She's another person from Iowa State. Iowa State right now is one of the centers for monarch research. There's a little thing going on there where they've had a number of really good graduate students out of Iowa State recently. And you're going to hear from another one further on when we talk to hear from Tori Pocius. So they're really the center for monarch research at the moment. And of course, there are people all over the country. There's a good group at Michigan State doing monarch research. There's some other people that are getting into this in Pennsylvania. So, and you just heard from Anurag and you at Cornell, you heard from Patrick Guerra at Cincinnati. Patrick's putting together a good team. So there are going to be a number of new people on the block here to tell us a little bit about monarch biology and hopefully the future of monarch science is in really good hands. So with that, we'll go on to Kelsey Fisher, and Kelsey's done some really interesting work with radio tagging of monarch butterflies. Take it away, Kelsey.
Okay, thanks, Chip, and thanks everybody for being here. This is a really awesome opportunity to learn more about monarch butterflies. So today I'll be talking about some of my research that I've been doing for the past, I guess, 7 years with monarch butterflies and understanding movement ecology. When I say movement ecology, I'm thinking more at a local scale than the migration that we've been talking about up until now. My work is more related to how monarchs interact with milkweed during the breeding season. So not necessarily the migration, but it all kind of links together. So for my work and a lot of the work that's going on at Iowa State right now, the underlying reason for the work I'm doing is that understanding the biology and the movement ecology of monarch butterflies will influence where we should be establishing monarch habitat. And I think in my next few slides, I'll be able to win you over on that one. So here's an example of some habitat that I know is established in some areas in Iowa. So where those red images are in my map, that there's milkweed and there's nectar that the monarchs are able to use for oviposition and for foraging during their breeding season. And we know that the monarch butterflies are vagal, which means that they move around a lot. So they don't stay in one habitat patch for their entire life. They'll move and lay eggs across the landscape. And so if we see some monarchs in one of these habitat patches, then we know that they'll only be there for a short period of time, and then they're going to undergo movement to find another habitat patch. So probably one of these other red splotches. And so we know if there's milkweed and nectar resources in all of these different places, that the monarch will eventually find it. Chip has some really great examples that he's talked about where there's milkweed in someone's backyard and there's nothing surrounding for miles around, but there's still eggs and larvae on those plants. So the monarchs will find it if it's out there. The question is, how long does it take for them to get there? So if a monarch were in this this red splotchy part, and they decide that it's time to leave and go find another place to lay eggs, they'll probably undergo what's called a random walk behavior, which means that they'll just fly in a random direction and then maybe eventually they'll pick up on either a visual or an olfactory cue and they'll find another milkweed. But with all of this time and energy spent searching for milkweed, that's less time that they're able to interact with milkweed and be laying more eggs. So the basis for a lot of the work I've been doing is trying to understand how we could create functional connectivity across the Iowa landscape. So if we understand how far monarch butterflies can see and smell or detect milkweed, how far they typically fly between two locations, and the orientation in which they fly while they're looking for milkweed and nectar, then we could establish habitat that would create stepping stones across the landscape, which would reduce the amount of time that the monarchs spend wandering and increase the amount of time that monarchs are interacting with milkweed. So for example, here, we have a splotch where we know that there's milkweed and nectar, and then we have this L-shaped spot that we know there's milkweed and nectar. But if we add some habitat to connect these two, if we know that this is within the monarch's perceptual ability, then that would create a stepping stone across the landscape. And then they'd spend less time looking and more time with milkweed. So up until the point when I got to Iowa State, studies looking at insect movement and dispersal are very limited. And one of the big reasons is because insects are small and it's hard to keep track of them. And the technology isn't necessarily there because you can't put a GPS tag on a monarch butterfly like you can like a deer or something like that. And so when I started at Iowa State, I said, okay, let's figure out how we can do this. And so I decided to use radiotelemetry. I think I jumped ahead a little bit, but I'll get there. So like I was saying, the parameters, like how far monarchs can see and smell, and how straight movements are that they travel between habitat patches, really influences how much time monarchs spend with milkweed and how many eggs get laid. So when I first arrived at Iowa State, there was a postdoc named Tyler Grant, and he developed an agent-based model to look at how monarchs move across the landscape and how they're laying eggs along that time. So pretty much this is a video game. We have an image of Iowa's landscape, and then Tyler would throw some monarch butterflies in that landscape and set some parameters like how far the butterflies can see and smell, how straight their flight paths are, and different things like that. And then the butterflies would move and they'd lay eggs along the way as they're doing this. So then at the end, we get to see where a bunch of eggs have accumulated based on their different parameters that they were set. And as you can see here, A, B, and C are the yellow spaghetti looking lines are movement paths of monarch butterflies. And A, B, and C have different parameters set for perception and for how straight the flight paths are. So for A, the butterfly can only see and smell about 50 meters away, but they travel in straight lines between two locations. In B, the monarchs can see and smell really far for 400 meters, and they also travel in straight lines. And then for C, the monarchs can only see and smell for 50 meters, so it's short perceptual ability, and they turn around a lot with low directionality. So that just means that so as you can see with these different parameters, the butterflies are using space in very different ways. And that means that their eggs would be accumulating in different places. And when the butterflies can see really far and they travel in straight lines, you can tell that they don't leave where the good stuff is, because they know that there's nothing else good out there. So these parameters really influence how eggs get accumulated across the landscape. And with more, we ultimately want monarchs to lay more eggs, because more eggs means more caterpillars become more butterflies, and then that's more individuals that have the opportunity to migrate back south down to Mexico. So we want them to lay as many eggs as they can. So I tried to use radio telemetry to figure out which one of these, how these parameters are set so that they represent what monarchs really are doing. And so VHF radio telemetry is a little active transmitter that I attach to the underside of the monarch butterfly's abdomen. It has a battery and a circuit, and it emits a radio frequency. And then I use a antenna and a receiver, and I can pick up that frequency so I can relocate my butterflies after I've released them. There's lots of other things we can talk about with this, but I think that was kind of the basic understandings that need to happen for the rest of my work. So the transmitter weighs about 1/4 gram, and butterflies on average weigh about 1/2 gram. So it is about half of their body mass, but I've done a bunch of studies with undergraduate students to determine that it doesn't really influence their behaviors. Maybe the butterflies that have transmitters attached to them rest a little bit more than butterflies that don't have transmitters, but they still spend the same amount of time flying and feeding and doing normal butterfly things. So using this technology to track for monarch butterflies, I did a series of experiments. The first one that I did was I released some butterflies with radio transmitters in a restored prairie just to see if we would be able to figure out how to use this technology to track the monarchs. So this image here is just pretty much playing connect the dots with monarch butterfly locations as they were flying through the prairie. And I was able to get approximations of step length, so the distance between two locations, and turn angle, which is the angle created from 3 locations, which are directly related to the model that Tyler was working on. So for example, a step length would be the distance between location number 20 and location number 21. And a turn angle would be the angle created from 19, 20, and 21. So that just shows how straight the butterflies are flying. And what you can see here is the butterflies, while they're within a prairie, are not traveling in straight lines. They're flying around and turning around a lot. So after I did some stuff in a restored prairie, we decided to see if we could figure out how to determine perceptual range. So we went to a sod field, which was just a big grass area where I could run around and chase my butterflies very easily. And there was only one signal coming up from the background. So just grass, and then we brought butterflies out with some potted blazing star and common milkweed, and we released the butterflies various distances downwind from the milkweed and the nectar resources to see when the butterfly would be able to find it. So if the nectar resources and milkweed are within the visual and perceptual ability of the monarchs, they would fly directly to it. So what we were doing was just releasing them various distances downwind and then seeing when the flight was directly to those resources. And then after we did some perceptual testing, we also went a lot on a much bigger scale where we had some different areas that had different types of land cover. So this is a big field site that has some corn and some soybean growing, some restored prairie, some grass waterways, lots of different habitat types. And then I would release butterflies with radio transmitters in the different habitat types to see how long it takes for them to get to a milkweed or a nectar resource based on where they were located. And so with this, I was able to look at step length, turn angle. I also could get some information on perceptual range, and then additionally some space use, which I haven't talked about yet, but still it's just where the butterflies are using space and where their resources are located. So from all of this work, my summarized results are that the radio telemetry can be employed to study monarch movement. Like Chip, I'm sure you probably have heard the stories that I was talking about earlier. We were able to observe monarchs fly greater than 500 meters over crop fields to find resource habitats. And they flew directly over them. The flights that I was observing were really oriented with the wind. Sometimes the butterflies, when they were looking for nectar resources and milkweed, were flying into the wind because they were looking for chemical signals. And other times they would fly with the wind so that they could cover longer distances with less energy expenditure. Most of the time, the monarch butterflies were taking steps that were less than or equal to 50 meters. But the orientation of the movement was really influenced by what type of habitat they were covering. So if they were over top of a restored prairie where there was nectar and milkweed, they were turning around a lot. Whereas if they were over a cornfield, they were flying in straight lines. Some of my studies provide evidence that the monarch butterfly's perceptual range is greater than 125 meters, which is actually a lot larger than most other butterfly species estimate perceptual range. But then in addition, we saw these really large steps that monarchs were taking greater than 2 kilometers to find another habitat patch. So we were able to get a lot of information that we wouldn't have had if we weren't using radio telemetry. So if we pull all of this together, my recommendation for habitat establishment across Iowa would be, it would be really great if we could establish small patches of milkweed and nectar resources approximately 50 meters apart across agricultural landscapes, because most of the movement steps were approximately 50 meters. However, because of some of the other behaviors that the monarchs exhibit, like flying into the wind, taking large dispersal steps, it doesn't have to be perfect. So we don't have to have a perfect 50-meter grid across Iowa in order to facilitate movement. What I often say to landowners or to people that have milkweed in their backyard is it's really great if you have milkweed in your backyard, but we want to make sure that your neighbors have it too, because we really want to create that connectivity. And then finally, the information that I've gotten from my research has been informing Tyler's model for the past 7 years. And we now are working on having a manuscript that combines all of the work that's been going on with the monarch butterfly research group at Iowa State into a collaborative manuscript, and it's in review. So fingers crossed it gets accepted, and that'll be out for everyone to learn more about what we've been doing. So thank you.
All right. What a great message that was, right? Every 50 meters, every neighbor you've got, more waste stations, more waste stations. You see the sign when you came in? 41,000 so far that are registered. Tori, she has a long legacy of working with monarch people. She started out as an undergraduate working with Lincoln Brower. Then she came to me, got a master's degree with me, and then she went to Iowa State and got a PhD at Iowa State working with John Pleasants. So there's connections all around with many of these people.
Good morning. My name is Tori Pocius, and I'm really excited to talk to you this morning about some of my recent research regarding the flight energetics of monarch butterflies reared on different milkweed species. We're all very familiar with the monarch migration and the fact that we have 3 different populations within the continental US. For this talk, we'll be focusing on the monarch population that occurs east of the Rocky Mountains. As monarchs leave Mexico and repopulate the full extent of their summer breeding range, they encounter different milkweed species. We have 3 different examples here, all of which look pretty different. We have over 100 milkweed species in North America, and we know that monarchs use about 40 of them for oviposition and for larval food sources. Understanding that monarchs use different kinds of milkweed as larval hosts, we wanted to understand if there was a trade-off between nutrition and performance. Just like if you think about a marathon runner eating a piece of chocolate cake versus really trying to eat healthy and be prepared and fueled to race, the same thing could be true for a monarch. And some milkweeds may set them up better for flight metabolism than others. We know that there are differences in survivorship to adults, as well as differences in size of pupae and adults based on which milkweed the larvae ate, as well as differences in adult lipid storage in addition to those other metrics based on their larval diet. We really want to understand, once we get to the adult stage, taking it one step further, we know that they are bigger or smaller, they have more or less lipid stores, but does that translate into a difference in flight or resting metabolic rate? Most importantly, what happens when it's time for the adults to fly? Currently, we have little data on adult metabolic rate, including when monarchs are in flight. And we really need to understand if milkweed diet contributes to flight energetics or an overall body maintenance cost. In order to do this, we compared adult performance across a range of host plants. And we did expect differences between milkweed diets, especially those with higher cardenolide content. We investigated 8 different milkweeds, including 7 that are native to the continental US and 1 non-native species, tropical milkweed, because that plant is so attractive to monarchs and it does have a very high cardenolide content compared to some of the native species. In order to conduct this trial, we started with milkweeds grown without any chemical pesticide input, and we added 5 first instars to each plant. We monitored those larvae daily until they pupated. If they ran out of plant material while they were feeding, we just added another plant. Once they pupated, we allowed the pupae to harden for about 24 hours, then moved them to the lab, where we've got their weight, length, and width for comparison purposes, so that we really understood if those differences that were cited in prior work held up. After adults closed, we allowed their wings to dry for 24 hours, then determined if they were male or female. We got a weight at eclosion, and we also determined their wing length and width. Then we allowed them to feed for 8 days in the lab with unlimited nectar supply, because in an earlier study, we determined that their metabolic output was most consistent when they were about 8 days old. Then these 8-day-old adults were weighed immediately before flight and then flown for 5 minutes with agitation. So what that looked like, we have a flow-through respirometry setup where we start with the butterfly in a jar, which is very similar to a human athlete hooked up to a metabolic system. They're allowed to fly with agitation for 5 minutes. And during this time, clean air was going into the system while the air that the animal had used was coming out and was being processed by our carbon dioxide and oxygen sensor, which produced a graph like this for each adult that was flown. Then after adults were flown, we were able to freeze them in liquid nitrogen to preserve all of their muscle tissue. And we used their abdomens to determine their lipid content. So thinking about flight muscle investment across these 8 species, we have our 8 species designated on our x-axis across the bottom, and our flight muscle ratio, which is just the weight of flight muscles compared to full body mass along our y-axis. And we can see that we do have significant differences across species. We see differences between tropical milkweed and those larvae that fed on Sullivan's and world milkweed. We also see differences between larvae that fed on showy milkweed and those that fed on Sullivan's milkweed. When we look at mass normalized resting metabolic rate, which means the total cost, the total energetic cost of body maintenance, we also see differences by milkweed species. Again, we see that those larvae that ate tropical milkweed have a higher body maintenance cost compared to those that fed on Sullivan's milkweed. We also see that those that fed on showy milkweed have a higher resting metabolic rate compared to those that fed on Sullivan's milkweed, common milkweed, or world milkweed. Next, looking at mass normalized flight metabolic rate. So the metabolic rate when these adults were moving and flying for that 5-minute period, we see differences again by milkweed diet. We see that those adults that fed on tropical milkweed have a higher flight metabolic rate compared to adults that fed on Sullivan's milkweed. We also see a difference with those that fed on world milkweed. Finally, we looked at metabolic rate and cardenolide content. So we have a correlation between the amount of cardenolides along our x-axis and the resting metabolic rate along our y-axis. We have the same for the flight metabolic rate, and we can see that there is a positive relationship here. So we have a significant correlation between wing cardenolide content and both resting and flight metabolic rates. So this means that the wing cardenolide content was a significant predictor of both normalized metabolic rate at rest and during flight, providing support for the hypothesis that adults that are exposed to higher levels of toxic plant defenses, in this case cardenolides, causes increased energy expenditure by adult butterflies. Overall, our conclusions were that flight muscle ratio was significantly affected by larval host plant. Larval diet also significantly affected both resting and flight metabolic rate. And finally, that larval exposure to higher levels of toxic plant defenses caused increased energy expenditure by adult butterflies. In the future, we're working on investigating the effect of nectar availability on flight. So if you have a full unlimited nectar diet versus a restricted diet, does that impact your flight metabolism? We're also looking at the impacts of diet on long-term flights. So when you're flying longer for 5 minutes, let's say more like an hour, do those differences remain, or do they wash out because you're able to recover a little bit more over time? And finally, we're also looking at the effect of microbes on the milkweed leaf surface with how monarchs are interacting with those plants. So stay tuned. Hopefully those results will be ready soon. I'd like to thank all of my lab mates at Penn State and at the University of Alabama, in addition to the Ernst Native Seed Company and the USDA lab in Ames, Iowa, for helping us get our monarch colony started, as well as all of the undergraduates that made this research possible. Thank you so much for your attention, and please let me know if you have any questions. My Twitter handle and email are below. Thank you so much.
All right, looks like it's okay. Thanks, everybody. I'm really sorry I can't be there in person. I have a lot of commitments here in Madison, but I'm really excited to join you via Zoom. I am not one of the younger monarch researchers. I'm one of the older ones. In fact, I've been working on monarchs. Chip and I actually together wrote the first grant for Monarch Watch. Remember that, Chip, way back with Brad Williamson. So that goes back, I don't even know what decade it was in, but a long, long time ago. And I would like to echo other people's congratulations to Chip. It's amazing that this has been going for 30 years. And to offer my sincere thank you to Chip Taylor for introducing me to both monarchs and my husband. So Chip, you have played a really big role in my life, and both of those relationships were great. So what I'm going to talk about today is just kind of some big picture stuff. I've really enjoyed hearing all of the other talks, and I think this goes pretty well. I'm going to talk kind of continuing with what Kelsey was talking about, where and how we can focus limited conservation resources as we're thinking about increasing the numbers of monarchs out there. So also echoing Anurag, who talked about the importance of citizen science, and also John, we really do know a lot about monarchs, and that's thanks to a lot of people in this room. This slide is not meant for you to read everything on it, but there's a very long list of programs that are collecting data on monarch populations throughout their entire annual cycle of breeding and migrating and overwintering. So we really do know a lot about monarchs, and there's a lot that we have to learn, but I think we're taking good advantage of what we already know. So we do know, and I'm not going to go through all of the data because I only have 10 minutes, but we do know that habitat and weather are key drivers for monarchs. And I've listed some of the key papers that have shown this. Many people in this room are co-authors on a lot of these papers, but over and over, we see that the availability of habitat, especially breeding habitat, and weather are key determinants of what monarch numbers will be in any given year. And as Chip said in the very beginning, there's also a correlation between numbers one year, the numbers that we see in Mexico, and the numbers that we see up here in the summer and spring. So lots and lots of drivers that we're really beginning to understand because we have so many years of data now. So there's pretty good agreement, thanks to work by John Pleasance and many other people, that to get back to a stable monarch population, a monarch population that reaches a level at which we can feel pretty comfortable that it's not going to continue to decline, we need approximately 1.4 billion more milkweed stems on the landscape. And again, lots of good science behind that number. It's really important that we think of nectar plants too, but like Tori implied, it's harder to quantify the value of the nectar plants. So we often focus on milkweed. And we can think of this from a regional perspective, where across the whole landscape of the monarch world will habitat make the most difference? And then if we drill down, what are the biggest opportunities for focusing restoration efforts? So where do we put that habitat on the landscape? So I'm going to go back a few years to a big demographic model that several of us wrote, over 5 years ago now. And we compared conservation scenarios in different parts of the monarch range. And this was a stepwise model where we basically, on top of a map, we put where monarchs are at any given time, what generation they're in. And basically these arrows on the map represent transitions from one stage to the next. And what we want is successful survival and increase in the population along these arrows. And we asked the question, should we focus our conservation efforts in one region or the other? If we increase the success of any one of these arrows, where should we focus our efforts? We might say in this north central region, because we go through so many generations of monarchs. We might say in Mexico. So we modeled using the best we knew about what were the drivers in each of these regions. And this is kind of a busy table with a lot of numbers on it. But basically, we came up with a lot of scenarios that are increasing the quality of those arrows, or the quantity of monarchs that move in those arrows. And we want a population growth rate above 1. We want the population to increase. So a growth rate of 1 is it's not increasing or decreasing. Less than 1 means it's decreasing. And then we said, what happens if we tweak the parameters that drive the monarchs in any one of these big areas on the map? If we tweak them by a given percentage, what happens to this population growth rate? And what we see, so a bigger increase in parameters will be more difficult. A smaller increase in parameters will be easy. We want to achieve this more than 1%, more than 1 population growth rate. And you can see if we only do one thing at a time, we get the most bang for our buck by increasing the effectiveness or the success of breeding in the southern part of the United States and breeding in this north central region where a lot of us are right now. We only need a 2% increase in these parameters to get above a population growth rate of 1. But if we combine all of the scenarios, if we increase across the migratory range of monarchs, we only need a 1% increase in each of them to get a very large population growth rate. So basically what we said in this paper from a while ago now is that all hands on deck is the most effective. So we need to cooperate across the breeding range and breeding, migratory, and overwintering range. So if we drill down a little more, and this is some new research that just came out of University of Wisconsin, we were interested in what makes any given site more effective. So this ties in really well to what Kelsey was talking about a couple talks ago. So we went out to 60 different sites in southern and west central Wisconsin. We went to each of these sites 3 times a summer for 2 summers, and we assessed monarch density. We looked at both adults, so we counted adults using pollard walks, and eggs and caterpillars. And we said, what are the factors that affect the density of adults and immatures that we see in any one of these sites? And we purposefully picked the sites to represent a range of sizes. So we picked small sites and large sites. And we also were interested in the amount of grasslands in the surrounding area. So these sites were not randomly chosen. They were chosen to represent a range of habitat qualities. And the habitat qualities that we were interested in were the impacts of the surrounding landscape on monarch use of an area. So if we look at any one of these sites, we can measure on a landscape scale how much grassland is within 10 kilometers of that site. So that's the landscape scale that we looked at. And we also looked at the patch scale. So for a given patch, what was the density of milkweed in the patch? Here you can see a super dense patch of milkweed. What was the density of blooming plants in that site? So we did look at both host plant and nectar plant availability, and then the impact of the size. So patch level qualities and landscape level qualities. And I'm not going to show you a bunch of graphs. I'm just going to summarize what we found in the interest of time. So like I said, we looked at both adults and immature monarchs, and we found that there was higher adult density in sites that have higher milkweed density, more blooming plants, and actually less grassland in the surrounding landscape. So if we have a site that's kind of isolated, what this suggests is that monarchs are finding this site. So the perception is super important, the research that Kelsey was just talking about that's going on. But we find that they are drawn to these sites that are kind of islands of habitat. So those were the main things that affected adult density. And the things that affected egg and larval density were milkweed density. So more milkweed, more eggs and larvae in a site. Interestingly, blooming plants did not have an effect on larval density, which suggests that adults are coming in and using these sites as adult resources. But again, we found that less grassland in the surrounding landscape meant a higher density of monarchs in any given site. And site area didn't matter. They came to small sites just as often as they came to big sites. So that was interesting and kind of unexpected. So here we have data-driven evidence that from the first study that I talked to you about, we need conservation efforts across the migratory cycle and in all types of habitat. And also that conservation in small isolated patches is effective. And I'm gonna copy Kelsey in saying, I have the same quote, build it and they will come. They will find these isolated patches of milkweed. And I want to just end by talking about, I said in the beginning that habitat and climate are both important. And I haven't talked at all about climate, but I want us to think about the importance of having habitat out there everywhere in the face of climate change. And this is especially important in a world that's dominated by agriculture. So this site, Chip, you've been here. This is a site that my family used to have in Western Wisconsin, kind of in the middle of all those dots on the map that I just showed you. This is a restored prairie. We no longer have this. It's now owned by a really wonderful couple that the woman used to work for the Fish and Wildlife Service. So she has continued maintaining this land. Which is really wonderful. So you can see this is great habitat. It's amazing habitat, but this is where it is. This is the dot. This is where I was standing when this picture was taken. This is a little tiny bit of habitat surrounded by a sea of corn and soybeans. It is corn and soybeans everywhere. We have this 40 acres and this 40 acres. Everything else here. In fact, this used to be CRP land just north of us right here. It's now corn. They don't have the Google map from when that changed. So there were a ton of monarchs that came to this site. So this island is important. And when we think about climate change, this is why it's so important. These are precipitation and temperature rank maps that rank how different from average temperature and precipitation were in the United States. I'm sorry, I don't have the August and September. They're not quite out yet. But you can see there's a big range. So the blue areas on this map are sites that were above average precipitation. The darker yellowish and reddish areas were below average precipitation. And it's a mishmash, even in Wisconsin, where I am, Minnesota, there's high above average and below average areas. And we get a similar thing with temperature. It's variable across the range, some really hot areas here in Michigan and the northeastern US. So what we need is in any given year, we need there to be habitat in the places that are good for monarchs that year. We can't count on, any given site that we put a ton of effort into being good for monarchs. If it's hot and dry, no matter what we plant there, it's not going to be good for monarchs every year. So we really need this habitat spread out everywhere and it becomes more and more important in the face of climate change. So this matters. I read the New York Times early in the morning every day, and I just thought this would be a wonderful quote for this meeting. This is by Tim McDonald in an opinion page. And he said, we have the ignominious, I don't say that word often, ignominious distinction of being the only species to be individually responsible for a global extinction crisis. And because of that, we have a moral responsibility to protect the species that we have imperiled. But, and Chip says this all the time, conservation is not just altruistic, it's also selfish. Because biodiversity is important for the maintenance of the ecological systems that allow us as humans to eat, drink, and breathe. Left unchecked, climate change and ecological collapse, that loss of habitat, could someday drive us to extinction too. So I'm going to stop now, and I'm just about on time with my 10 minutes. Congratulations again to Monarch Watch and Chip and Ann and Jim for all the amazing work you're doing. And again, I really wish I could be there in person.
Thank you, Chip and Monarch Watch, for inviting me to give this short update on Western monarchs that I've titled "What a Difference a Year Makes," because this past year really has been a landmark year in terms of monarch ecology, I think. My name's David James. I'm at Washington State University, and I've been studying Western monarchs for 20 years or so now. So this time last year, we had great trepidation. We wondered what the winter would bring. This was because the previous winter's record low overwintering numbers were extremely concerning. And we wondered if the population was going to rebound, or would it continue its slide down to extirpation or extinction, as some people thought. There had been a lot of talk about extinction and extinction risk, and this followed a paper that was published in 2017 that came to the conclusion that 30,000 butterflies is probably the extinction threshold for Western monarchs. And up until that point in time, our overwintering populations had numbered each year around about 200,000 for quite a long period of time. But wouldn't you know it, as soon as the paper was published, we had an overwintering population of 30,000, and also in the following year. So, you know, the concern over the population in the West was heightened, particularly with the knowledge of the extinction threshold. But that fear was nothing compared to November 2020, when just 1899 monarchs were recorded for the entire Western population at all the overwintering sites. That really was a shocking result for everybody. So it was the lowest recorded in 25 years. However, winter breeding in the San Francisco Bay area suddenly became exceedingly common that winter. From in previous years, when maybe half a dozen reports were recorded each year, suddenly there were hundreds of reports of breeding. And I wondered, were these two things linked? So I went back to look at what conditions the incoming migrant monarchs had encountered before they actually reached the coastal overwintering sites. And I found that the temperatures in San Francisco Bay area anyway, and probably for a large part of the coastal California area, it was the warmest conditions ever recorded. The highest temperatures recorded were reported that year. So much greater than the long-term mean. There were many days when temperatures exceeded the mid-80s, and on a couple of occasions reaching 100 degrees. So migrants would have encountered quite a different weather, climate, temperature regime than what they should be encountering. So they were exposed to record high temperatures during that period as migrants coming into the Bay Area. And I think this resulted in winter breeding. We also had some tagging going on that year. And for the first time, none of our tagged butterflies from the Pacific Northwest were found in overwintering populations. They were all found, a similar number as we would expect. They're all found in the Bay Area, usually associated with milkweed. So this was another clue for me as well. So perhaps it was these record high temperatures that caused the record low overwintering population. And perhaps the overall population in the West, if you could measure it, likely hadn't changed substantially from the previous year. You know, it may have still been around 30,000 as it was the previous year at the overwintering sites. But because breeding populations are uncountable, of course, there's no way of knowing this. So we can speculate that perhaps the missing 28,000 monarchs were present in inland California as winter breeding butterflies, but that is just speculation. There's no way of proving that. But we did see some indications that this might have happened by looking at the migration back to the Pacific Northwest in the spring, which appeared to be better or as good as in the previous year. So it looked like the very low population of less than 2,000 individuals produced a migration that was as strong as the previous year, when the overwintering population was about around 30,000. And some data to back this up are the sightings reported in June and July in Oregon and Washington in both years. And so in 2020, after the very low population, the previous year was 26, after an overwintering population of 30,000, and in 2021, 31. So, quite similar. So it is, I think, likely that progeny from the winter breeding populations did contribute to the summer Pacific Northwest populations in 2021. We have to think that it's not really possible for an overwintering population of 1899 to produce a subsequent overwintering population of more than 200,000, which I'm getting ahead of myself here, but that's what happened. So it's just, a small population like that mathematically cannot produce a very large population. And Chip's actually done some calculations to support that idea. So with the speculation in my mind and the thoughts about what was going on, I wrote this commentary piece in March 2021 that promoted a more favorable outlook for the monarch. I didn't think it was, despite the very low population that was recorded at the official overwintering sites, I didn't think it was on, extinction was imminent. And I based most of this idea from my previous experience with the monarch in Australia, where I worked on the ecology and biology of overwintering monarchs in the Sydney area. And my main conclusion from that work was how adaptable the monarch is to changing climate conditions. And so with that in mind, I gave the monarch a lot more credit for its adaptability than perhaps a lot of other people were doing at the time. And some people actually called it the Pollyanna view, which I'll take because I'm an optimist. So summer 2021 in the West, we had actually larger populations in the Pacific Northwest than in the previous year. There's also substantially greater populations in Utah, Arizona, and Nevada. So overall, the monarch population appeared to be doing very well after the very low numbers recorded in the previous winter. I mean, a lot of us were not expecting to see a monarch last summer, but there was a decent number, much more than we would have expected. And so again, we have to wonder, how did a reasonable summer population come from just 1899 monarchs? Well, it's just not possible. So last year's summer population in the West flew into the San Francisco Bay Area and encountered very different conditions from the year before. No record high temperatures last year. The temperatures were generally average or below average. And this was the case all along the California coast. So, in theory, there should not be as much reproduction or diversion of migrants into breeding populations. They should continue to the coast. No temperature distraction. And indeed, that's what happened. There was an incredible rebound in the population. From 1899 individuals the previous year, the official overwintering count last year was 247,246 individuals. So, people were awestruck by the size of the increase. I like to think of it as a Pollyanna vindication, perhaps. I mean, as I've indicated, my view was optimistic, but even this rebound exceeded my optimism. So what of this year? I've been looking at or recording sightings in the Pacific Northwest throughout the summer, and this graph shows the results of that, and also the previous years, where you can see the in the previous 4 years, the numbers were fairly low. But this past summer, the numbers of reported sightings have increased by 9-fold. So that's quite stunning. The large overwintering population last year has had a very good breeding summer. And these individuals now are headed on their way towards California. And this is where we leave the story as to what happens. Will there be a 9-fold increase in overwintering populations? I really don't think so, because that would take the overwintering populations to more than 2 million, and that's never happened. The biggest we've had is 1.3 million back in '97. But I do think the population is going to be large this year, at least as large as last. And I'm willing to bet there could be a population of at least 300,000 this year. And if this happens, this would make it the 4th best overwintering population ever recorded in the West. However, the caveat is that if migrants encounter above average temperatures in September, October in California, they will breed and not cluster, as we saw in 2020. And of course, at this point in time, mid-September, we don't know the outcome of that. There's been a hot week and there's been a cool week. Next week's going to be cool too, and then it's going to be a hot week. So we'll have to wait until the end of this period to see how the migrants fare, whether they continue on to the overwintering sites or whether they stop off and breed. And if they do, then winter breeding will be common in inland urban areas again in California this winter, like it was in 2020. And clustering populations will be small, but that is yet to be seen. So to finish, taking a holistic view, my holistic view, and I think we should view monarchs in a holistic way, not just focus on any one particular threat to them or impact on them. We need to take the bigger picture view. And doing that, I think monarchs will persist in the West. I do not believe they'll be extirpated. They're far too adaptable for that. Breeding and non-breeding populations will occur in California every winter, and the proportion of breeding and non-breeding will probably depend each year on autumnal conditions. September, October temperatures will probably dictate whether the overwintering populations at traditional sites are large or small. And overall, though, I think the Western population will grow long-term, simply as our long-term conservation measures take effect. Just like in the East, we're doing a lot in the West to help breeding populations, and all those things will come to fruition at some point in the future. So thank you very much for listening. I just want to acknowledge a few people here written there, including Chip, of course, has been a great help to me throughout my career. And all the citizen scientists involved in the research that I've done in the West over the last 20 years. And must mention the Western Monarch Advocates. We're holding a summit in January next year in San Luis Obispo, close to the Pismo overwintering site, which hopefully will host a vast number of monarchs next January. Thank you for listening.
All right, I got a comment. There was a tremendous amount of concern about the Western population, as David said. And when in the Eastern population, it went down to 0.67 hectares in 1913 or 2013, it was extremely worrisome. And that led to all of these propositions to declare the monarch threatened and so on and so forth. That led to the first thing. But if you go back, as I have, through all of the temperature records going back to 1895, you can see that there is a good likelihood that the monarch numbers in the past were much lower than they are now. You think about the dirty 30s, and some of you probably were there. I just barely, I was born in 37. But I was a little bit too young to remember that. But anyway, the dirty 30s, that was 8 years of extreme temperatures and extreme dust pollution, which had to sit on all of these host plants and had to mess up a lot of the nectar acquisition. The population had to be really low at the end of the dirty 30s. And if you go back in the early 1900s, there are cold periods there that we have not seen in any of our lifetimes that really had to knock the monarchs back. So, as David said, this population has extraordinary resilience, and we have to take these observations of where the population is going with a good deal of caution and a good deal of wisdom here. And this is why research is really important, to kind of understand all of these dynamics so that we don't overstep our bounds in our decision making. All right, end of preaching. I'll let the next one go on here.
Okay, so I'm Wendy. I'm the executive director of an organization called the Monarch Joint Venture, which you might all be familiar with. So taking us from this morning's talks on research into a higher level view of the community of partners that are involved in the growing community network of people involved in monarch conservation. I've had the honor of helping to engaging with and helping to grow this community for the last 15 years. So as we celebrate 30 years of Monarch Watch, I've been part of that for about 15. So looking back, I'm not going to go through each of these steps in this timeline, but I kind of wanted to put this into a longer timeline context. So starting with and leading up to the 1975 overwintering site discovery, which we know was well known to the local people there, but made known more broadly to North America at that time. And then the launch of several grassroots community science and other conservation efforts in the 1990s, like Monarch Watch. But you see this uptick in government, in federal action, in state action, in activity starting around 2014, and that's when the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service was petitioned to consider monarchs as threatened under the Endangered Species Act. And so from there, we started to see various different sectors of partners start to come to the table who hadn't really been there in any major fashion before. Leading up to, most recently, if you didn't hear, you probably weren't reading the news that migratory monarchs were added to the IUCN Red List as an endangered species. So grounding us in our goals, really to accomplish this goal of 6 hectares, I'm going to focus just on eastern monarchs for the sake of saving time, but to get us to this goal of 6 hectares consistently, sustainably of overwintering monarchs, we need something like 1.8 billion additional milkweed stems on the landscape, millions of acres restored or enhanced and protected, and we really need all hands on deck to get there. So bringing this around to partnerships, how do we engage all hands on deck? This research, I think, is a foundational piece in our conservation approach for monarch butterflies. Really what those colorful dots show you. They looked at various scenarios with agriculture, with rights of way, with citizen involvement, various different sectors of North America, and what kind of land they had influence over and what kind of adoption they might have in putting high quality monarch and pollinator habitat back on the landscape. And so really in this combination of different sectors and different adoption rates, there are 2 ways to get to this conservation target of 1.8 billion milkweed stems. One is if we convert all of the marginal agricultural lands into high quality pollinator habitat. And we know the likelihood that that's going to happen is very, very small, impossible. And the only other way to get there is if we engage all hands on deck. And so that means that everyone has an important role to play in monarch conservation. And so then our role becomes reaching them and getting them to get engaged in a meaningful way. So kind of building off of that, our role as the Monarch Joint Venture is to convene people and connect people, to distill information. There's so much information about monarch conservation out there, and we need to make sure we're presenting it and getting it out there to these different networks of people in ways that speak to them. We fill gaps and curate tools and resources to help this community of partners and really serve as an important leader and authority for providing technical guidance and planning and prioritization for monarch conservation across the United States. We do this in what we call 4 pillar areas. So kind of first and foremost, our goal in everything is to get more habitat on the ground, but we accomplish that in several ways. And, you know, we don't have staff all over planting milkweeds, but we can engage this network of partners to create more habitat. We can accomplish a lot of that through educational efforts, but also advancing the science to help us better understand and inform future conservation efforts. Central to that is partnership. We can't do what we do without this network of partners all across the US, which are, as you can see here, a wide range. We're at 120 plus partner organizations that represent everything from local volunteer-led groups and nature centers to state and federal natural resource agencies to businesses and academic institutions. So really a wide range of partners that are involved in this important effort. Kind of at a really high level, just wanted to go through some key initiatives in each of our program pillars. So we have a Monarchs and More curriculum where we're engaging teachers and the next generation in schoolyard gardens and monarch education. We provide professional development workshops for educators and also education courses for the general public. You might be familiar with our monthly Monarch Conservation webinar series. So lots of resources that are able to leverage the expertise of our network and share that out to the broader monarch conservation community. In the science realm, we administer 2 international scale monitoring programs, the Monarch Larva Monitoring Project. We co-manage with the University of Wisconsin Arboretum. So you just heard from Karen, who started that program and I worked with for a long time. And the Integrated Monarch Monitoring Program, which is a more robust effort to get habitat data and monarch use of that habitat from all across the United States in a really scientifically robust way. So we run a lot of applied research efforts through those various programs to better understand where monarchs are, what's the quality of their habitat, and how can we better improve those efforts moving forward. Developing tools, you can see the fun shot that I got here of a drone with a monarch flying overhead. We're developing some cool innovations with remote sensing and identifying, starting with using machine learning to identify and count stems of common milkweed, just as the start for this technology moving forward. And like Chip mentioned, we distributed the research review. This is something that we do every year to distill the science and send it back out to the community in a slightly more digestible way. Again, habitat is our main goal. Everything that we do, we want the end result to be more people putting more and more high quality habitat on the landscape. We have identified, if you remember back to the colorful dot chart, agriculture is a pretty important aspect and partner in that. And so we at the Monarch Joint Venture have prioritized strategies to really ramp up our engagement of agricultural stakeholders, because that's the area on the landscape where we can have the most impact for monarchs with increasing adoption and quality of that habitat. So we provide a lot of programs and technical assistance on private working lands. And that involves lots of things: conservation planning, tracking, monitoring, demonstration areas. So then just to talk briefly about kind of the networks within the network, there are many ways that these partners are engaging. So we're a national scale coordination body of monarch conservation, but groups are also convening at smaller scales. There are several states that have statewide initiatives like Missourians for Monarchs or the Illinois Monarch Project. Regions are convening. State Fish and Wildlife agencies have developed plans. There's both a Western Monarch Conservation Plan and a Mid-America Monarch Conservation Strategy. So these networks are forming within the network to fine-tune strategies at more localized scales. Sectors are convening. We're really active in a group called Farmers for Monarchs that's really convening agricultural stakeholders to work towards increasing adoption of pollinator habitat on farms. We work really closely with the rights of way sector. There's a rights of ways habitat working group that has a nationwide candidate conservation agreement with assurances, which essentially means it gives these energy and transportation companies some abilities, assurances, so that if they're proactively doing monarch conservation, should monarchs become listed, they have some general understanding and protections from regulations that might come from listing. And there's an incredibly growing network of zoos and aquariums that are getting involved in monarch conservation. So over 100 zoos across the US are signed on to this Monarch Safe program. So just really incredible networks growing within these networks. At the community level, there are incredible programs. You've heard about National Pollinator Week. There are monarch festivals that are popping up, and some, you know, we just had this Minneapolis Monarch Festival that was in its 14th year of existence just last weekend. There are fun programs that, like, we run a program called Miles for Monarchs. It's a fun wellness campaign just to get people active and talking more about monarchs to help spread the word. You're all very familiar with the Monarch Way Station program, an incredible tool to engage people in our communities. And as well as the things like the Mayor's Monarch Pledge, that getting our leadership within our communities to make a statement about getting more involved in conservation. So lots of tools. These are just a few examples, but lots of tools out there to help engage at the community level. So I think I will close you with some simple starting points. You know, this is what we push to everyone. You know, we need to plan and protect habitat. We need to contribute to and participate in existing programs. There's a lot of incredible opportunities out there to just dive right in and get involved in monarch conservation. And all that's concluded by exploring and learning and sharing that with our friends and neighbors and families, because we do need all hands on deck and need everybody to participate. Just a quick, you know, plug for the Monarch Joint Venture website. We are an incredible information clearinghouse. So if you haven't checked out our website, we have webinars, we have handouts, we have all kinds of things. So thank you.
All right, well, good afternoon. I'm Susan Meyers, and I am a volunteer for Monarchs across Georgia. Should I bring it closer to my mouth? Okay. Does that work better? All right, wonderful. I'm here to talk about the symbolic migration, which was created by Journey North 27 years ago. But today, it is a partnership between Journey North and Monarchs Across Georgia, which is a small little committee of 5 people of the Environmental Education Alliance. So Journey North is actually in charge of the maps on their website, just as they create those maps from all of the citizen scientists reporting sightings. They also host all of the educational materials on their website. Monarchs Across Georgia, as volunteers, we accept all of these paper butterflies that are made by students across Canada and the United States. They're all delivered to my house. My postal carrier knows me well. We open these envelopes, sort and count these wonderful butterflies that are made by these students. We package them up and we ship them down to Mexico, and they are received by Estela Romero. Of course, we're all volunteers here in Georgia, but it does cost money to operate this program. So we have to raise that money. Our participants pay $15 per group, and we accept donations. Our budget is about $19,000 a year, and we're just making it each year. I have to tell Estela each year, I think we can sign the contract for next year to keep you on board. So the idea behind this is that students in Canada and the United States are learning about the monarch, whether it's the life cycle, the migration, or just a variety of different components of the monarch. And they create these beautiful, what we call ambassador butterflies. They're made out of a manila folder. They carry messages from that group, that classroom, that family, that homeschool group, that nature club, of perhaps their experiences with a monarch, or maybe something about their hometown or their school. And then every child in that group colors a life-size monarch. They're clustered in size inside that manila envelope, and they fill out this little letter telling the student in Mexico, in Espanol, where they're from and how many kilometers their butterfly would fly from that hometown down to Angangueo, Mexico. They also have to draw the route of their butterfly. Estella takes these beautiful ambassador butterflies and delivers them to the children in the schools that surround the butterfly colonies. She also writes a blog about her visits there. On average, about 40 schools are visited. These ambassadors arrive around November the 1st when the real monarchs arrive. So that's the idea behind the symbolic migration. Along with these ambassador butterflies, Estella delivers an environmental message. Each year it's a little different, but it's all related to the monarch. One year it was about the fact that monarchs are pollinators. Not our best pollinators, but they do pollinate. And we talked about what are other pollinators as well. This past year, the topic was forest conservation and the benefit of trees. So the children learned about the uniqueness of their Oyamel forest, how to identify the different local tree species that were there, and they also had hands-on activities showing how different a degraded or deforested area would act with rainfall as opposed to a nice healthy forest. The kids got really excited about this. They also, of course, by reading what's inside of those ambassador butterflies, can learn about their counterparts in the north. They get to keep that ambassador butterfly as a gift from that group. They get to see on the map or a globe where that butterfly came from, and just have an amazing outdoor adventure. Environmental education is not a component of Mexican schools. Estella makes that happen. And this past year, we got many commendations from teachers and local officials about the impact that this program has had on the students. She's had students come back and bring their children because it made an impact on their lives about how they live in the forest now, and they wanted their children to be impacted with that same message. We have to take care of our land. As part of that environmental lesson that Estella gives each year, there's a letter with fill in the blanks or maybe a little bit of area where they can draw a picture. It's filled out by every student in the class. They write their name, the name of their town, and the closest sanctuary to where they live. Those letters are sent back to me, and then I distribute those letters along with a mixture of life-size butterflies from all the participating groups. And you never get your own little butterfly back. You might, if you're in Georgia, you might get butterflies from Canada and from California. We even have groups that are participating outside of the United States. So that's your return butterfly in the spring. This year, we are hoping to make our goal to impact 2,000 Mexican students, which means we need 2,000 ambassador butterflies. Of course, our deadline to receive those, well, to postmark them, is October the 7th, because we need to get them down to Mexico by November 1st. And then in the spring, we'll have them back to you in time to celebrate Cinco de Mayo. For more information, these are the websites. Of course, Journey North has the same information as the Environmental Education Alliance website. We welcome you to participate, and I thank you for the opportunity.
I have been digging through the IUCN website this morning, kind of figuring out everything that's going on. So it's not really breaking, but it's an issue about which there is a lot of confusion. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what it actually means that the monarch Danaus plexippus plexippus has been listed as endangered by the IUCN and how that relates to the whole species of monarchs, Danaus plexippus. So just a little bit of quick background on the IUCN Red List. This is just a list of information about animals, fungi, and plants and what their risk of extinction is. Basically, species are assessed and then placed in one of the IUCN Red List categories based on some very specific scientific criteria. And you can read all about this on their website, which I just took a screenshot of. Basically, species are assessed by trained individuals using whatever information is available about the species, books, indigenous knowledge, citizen science. They just pull everything together that there is. Then there are authorities who review the assessments, checking them against other things, and then publishing them on the IUCN Red List website. The author, the main author of the decision, or the trained individual, was Anna Walker, who's a butterfly and moth in the IUCN Butterfly and Moth Specialist Group, and she's also a species survival officer at the New Mexico Biopark Society. So when a species is assessed for, this is the case for every species that gets assessed by the IUCN, there are several possible outcomes, from data deficient, which basically means we don't know enough to make an assessment, to least concern, all the way up to extinct is obviously the worst thing to be if you're a species. And these specific criteria, so in order to meet the criteria for being listed in one of these categories, they have to meet very specific numerical data in any of these categories. So when they meet these numerical thresholds, depending on what they're assessed as, they might be listed as critically endangered, which means they're in very immediate danger of becoming extinct, to endangered, to vulnerable, or they could be worse or better off than any of these situations. So far, there have been almost 160,000 species assessed, or really that's their goal. They're up to about 148,000 species assessed. And of all of the species that have been assessed, a little over a quarter of them have been called threatened or endangered. So that's the red line on this graph. And the assumption is that they can tell a lot about a specific taxon by seeing what proportion of the individuals in that taxon are rated one thing or another. Obviously, they're never going to be able to assess all the millions of species there are in the world, but they're doing pretty well. And you can see that your chances of being endangered, if you're a species, really depend on what you are. Worse off are the cycads. You can see the red here is the critically, the worse off condition, or the one, sorry, I can't see my slide here because the zoom thing is there. Endangered in the wild, a lot of cycads are, extinct in the wild, up to endangered, which is the orange on this category, to least concern, which is the green. So most species are still least concern, but it really depends on what group you're in. Here you can see insects right here. A little over half of them are least concern, with varying numbers in here. You can also see here the number of species that have been assessed. Only 6,000 insects have been assessed. There are well over 1 million insects in the world, so we haven't assessed that many of the insects. So here was what, as Chip and I and Jim were communicating this morning, the IUCN has really clarified on their website what has been assessed, what is listed as endangered, and what's not. So I can share this with you. I gave this to Jim. So the results are available in a big, long, multi-page document for both the subspecies, Danaus plexippus plexippus, which is migratory monarchs, that's what we're mostly talking about today, versus the whole species, Danaus plexippus, which is another link. Danaus plexippus plexippus has been listed as endangered. Danaus plexippus, so the whole species, is listed as overall a species of least concern. So it's kind of breaking news. The date of the assessment was last August. Here are the authors, with Anna doing the bulk of the work and the rest of us just reviewing it and providing some monarch expertise. Other contributors, and so you can read more about the assessment right here. So just really quickly, why were monarchs listed as endangered? Remember, I showed you those 5 different criteria. So I'm going to just go through and tell you why monarchs, the Danaus plexippus plexippus, were listed as endangered. So under criterion A, which is population reduction, declines in the population have been observed for both the eastern and the western migratory populations. That's kind of a given. We all know that. But then the specific criteria, that they need to meet specific criteria for how much they have actually reduced. So over the last 10 years, the population size reduction based on actual numbers for the Western population and the index of abundance, which we use as the area that's occupied in Mexico for the Eastern population, is somewhere between 22 and 72%. As we talked about in the earlier talks, we partially understand why this has been occurring. These reasons have not ceased, and in many cases, they may not be reversible, depending on what happens with climate change. So monarchs meet the numerical criteria for population reduction in order to be listed as endangered. Another criterion is the probability that they'll actually go extinct. That was the 5th criterion that I listed on that slide. So as we heard from David this morning, the current and others, the current rates of decline are less concerning than they were in years past. Numbers have kind of stabilized for the Eastern population. As Chip said, they'll probably be lower this year, but if we look at the last decade, the numbers are not declining as quickly as they have been. So right now, the concern is whether there are enough individuals that can buffer the impacts of a stochastic event, like a terrible drought that covers a lot of their breeding range, or a storm in the overwintering site, something that kills off a large percentage of the population, which we know has happened in the past. And there have been mathematical models. David talked to you about the one for the Western population, and models of both the Eastern and the Western population suggest a quasi-extinction risk of somewhere between 5 and 43%. These are obviously really difficult. These numbers are difficult to predict, but this is what the numbers have estimated, published peer-reviewed papers. And what the IUCN says is that an extinction risk of 20% over the next 20 years is the threshold that they use for listing something as endangered under this criterion E, the extinction probability analysis. So monarchs meet this. So unless we disagree with the findings of these papers, monarchs meet this numerical criterion. And another thing that we looked at is the geographic range of species, and I've showed you kind of the geographic range of monarchs. The estimated area of occupancy ranges a lot, but we are seeing some continuing decline in the extent of their occurrence, the area that they occupy, the area, extent, and the quality of their habitat. But they do not meet the criteria for being listed because of a restricted geographic range. And that's because they don't occur in less than 5 locations, they're not severely fragmented, and they don't have the kinds of fluctuations in range or population size that species that would be listed under this criterion would need to have. So they're not qualified as endangered under this criterion. So what does this mean for monarchs? And this is where I think there's been so much confusion since this listing came out several months ago. Lots and lots of arguments and confusion and kind of odd publicity on all sides of this. We were definitely, those of us that were involved with this got barraged by media asking about this. And it's really important to understand that this IUCN listing carries no regulatory authority. Because monarchs have been listed by the IUCN, it doesn't mean that we have to do anything. It's basically a tool based on the best available science that we have right now that's meant to catalyze conservation action, which I think we would all agree is important. So hopefully this kind of just helps explain what this means. There's just been so much misinformation out there and argument about this. I think it's really important to remember the things on this slide, that this doesn't mean we have to do anything. A listing under the Endangered Species Act would carry regulatory authority, but this one doesn't. So I will stop now. Stop sharing my screen. And I know you're going to be talking about this later. Unfortunately, I have a meeting in 20 minutes, but I'm going to listen to what comes up next and would be happy to answer questions individually. And I've shared this PowerPoint with Jim, so he can share it with you.
Karen, would you be willing to take a few questions from the audience?
Sure.
So we can do this now.
Yep.
And this is totally unplanned, but we were going to do this later. But I think all of you who are interested in this, and many of you will be affected if monarchs are declared as endangered by the Fish and Wildlife Service. You probably have concerns and want some clarification. And if you have specific questions, I'm not sure how to do it, but I think there is a microphone at each desk. And you can press the button on the microphone if you have a question, and we can get a direct answer from Karen. So yes. Yeah, it says push right at the bottom. Thank you, Gail. Push right at the bottom. So if anybody has a question, you can ask Karen right now. Yes, Lori, right at the bottom.
Hi, Karen. Questions about the IUCN. Thank you for that presentation. It is a little hard to find all that information on their website. particularly who was part of drafting the analysis. Was it only the Schultz paper that was used for the West? That's question number one. Question number two, is there ever a reassessment for these designations, and how does that happen?
Yeah, first of all, the first question about the Schultz paper. So the Schultz paper was learned for the extinction probability. That's the only one, as far as I'm aware, any of us were aware at the time, that actually gives a specific estimate of the extinction risk for the Western population. And the Simmons paper is the only one that does that for the Eastern population. But for both the Eastern and the Western population, there were many, many other papers. So the bibliography for this this assessment is pages and pages long. So basically, everything that's out there was used for the combination of all of the criteria and the background. It's a pretty comprehensive list of resources. And reassessments occur. I mean, just like the endangered species lists in the United States, species are being reassessed if there's a reason, if it feels like things are changing. You know, hopefully species don't get worse off. But if things really improve, then there's definitely chances for reassessment. So the IUCN is just our best picture of what's going on right now. Thanks,
just
Tori.
one
Good to see you.
Yeah, it's nice to see. I hope you can see me.
I can see you.
Yep. Oh, that's great. Hi. So
Hi.
the other question is, on the IUCN website, the data ends at 2020, and it does not include that uptick. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, like any scientific paper, kind of like you heard from John Pleasance, the Monarch Watch data just went through 2015. So at some point you have to just say, we're going to do the analyses based on now. So, right, it ended in 2020. We started working on it in 2020. So at that time it was brand new. By August of 2021, when the whole package was submitted to the IUCN, the data from last winter for the California or the Western population weren't available yet. So yeah, the data come from 2020. The assessment was submitted, everything was submitted in August of last year.
Anybody else have a question?
I've got one. So I wondered, what do you think, just gut feeling, is the likelihood of seeing a Fish and Wildlife Service listing for the Monarch?
I do not tell anyone my opinion on that, even my partner. So sorry.
All right.
So I don't have a crystal ball about that. Yeah. That's it.
I have a little bit of a follow-up for that. Will Fish and Wildlife consider the IUCN designation in their ultimate decision, or is that just kind of an advisory type? You know, where does that fit with Fish and Wildlife?
Yeah, they were working with exactly the same data, the Fish and Wildlife Service and the IUCN. The criteria for listing are slightly different for those two organizations. And as we know, the Fish and Wildlife decision was warranted. Listing is warranted as threatened, but precluded because unfortunately we live in a world where a lot of species are much worse off than monarchs. So, right, it's not, I don't think that the IUCN listing will really affect the Fish and Wildlife decision, even though some of the people associated with the Fish and Wildlife Service, just because they are the experts on monarch numbers and they've thought of these numbers a ton since the petition was first submitted in 2014. So there were Fish and Wildlife Service people who were consulted during this process and are listed in the official document, but they will use their own criteria, and their decision, as Lori noted, will be based on what happens from 2020 to 2023. So, you know, if monarchs tank in the next 3 years, which knock on wood won't happen, then they'll have that information available to them. So their reassessment will be based on what happens, well, or at least will include information about what happens over the next couple of years.
We have a question over here from Brad Williamson.
Hi, Karen. Haven't talked to you for a long time.
Oh my gosh. I'm so glad I said your name at the beginning of my talk. It's good to see you. We both look a little older than we used to.
Okay. So my question is, if this does motor on to a fish and wildlife designation, do you have any thoughts about where all the citizen science that's so critical to monarch conservation is going to fit in? Because I don't see it fitting in real well unless it's a unique designation.
Right. So in the petition, there were specific recommendations. Obviously, the decision is made by the Fish and Wildlife Service, and they take all the science into account. But the petition itself did have some recommendations about things like monarch rearing, monarch handling, taking into account the fact that the science is really important. There would be some things that can happen because right now monarch rearing and handling is pretty much unregulated as long as you don't take monarchs across state lines, and then you just have to get a permit to do that. So they would make the decision on that, but certainly the request, the petition, did acknowledge that there was a lot of good that came from citizen science efforts. And right now, as we all know, there are rules in California that are based on monarchs being state listed in California that say you can't handle monarchs without a permit. But you can still observe them. You can still report them to Journey North or do the Monarch Larva Monitoring Project. You need a permit to tag them, to handle them. That's true in Canada and Mexico as well. But the permit, you know, it depends on what regulating agencies say about the difficulty of getting that permit and how many would be. But the petition, you know, at least the petition to the Fish and Wildlife Service did specifically acknowledge the value of citizen science and recommended the continuing inclusion of that in people's interactions with monarchs.
I'm Deb Tour from Canada. Okay, how closely does the Fish and Wildlife Service work with its Canadian counterparts, the Committee on Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada, since the monarch is a North American species? Are they collaborating in order for a future designation?
So
monarch?
It is, for international species, for species that cross state lines, and again, I used to teach about the Endangered Species Act, but I don't work for the Fish and Wildlife Service, and I don't know every single line in it by heart. But I know that for species that cross international boundaries, that the status of the species in all countries is taken into account. Certainly, there's a lot of collaboration at the individual level. So, for example, the paper that looked at the extinction risk for monarchs included biologists from all 3 countries. So there's certainly a ton of collaboration among individuals. And at the, you know, the designation of monarchs as whatever it turns out to be in the United States will be based on how much the Fish and Wildlife Service can actually do to, you know, if monarchs were listed, if they have the capacity to do everything that would entail. And that's why they weren't listed this time. There were just too many species. They couldn't do all of the species whose listing was warranted. But certainly there's scientific collaboration across country lines, but the listing decisions, so listing the species with Canada's listing of the species and the regulations in Canada and in Mexico are independent of what happens in the United States, just like is the case with states in the United States. Some states have restrictions, others don't.
Okay, can you hear me?
I can
Can
hear
you
you
hear
and
me?
I can see you. It's good to see you again.
Thank you, you as well.
We just
I'm
saw
in
each other
Calif-
recently.
Yes, and I'm in California. I'm just curious, what was the impetus for the IUCN to focus on monarchs at this time? It came out of nowhere. I mean, we of course here all know about the issues with monarchs. Why did they choose to focus on them? Was there some organizations putting pressure or encouraging it?
No, this is not driven by, it's not like people petition like happens in the United States with the Endangered Species Act. Basically their goal, and it's super interesting to read on the IUCN website what they're trying to do. It's an incredible effort. They can only assess species for which they have a lot of data. And they're trying to assess representative species, but they can only do that. And you know, for better or for worse, we know a lot about monarchs. So the impetus was monarchs. We know about monarchs. You know, if you look at those almost the 148,000 or so species, you will not have heard of many of them, but you will have heard of some of them. So they're just trying to get a representative sample of organisms. It's kind of like our way to take the pulse of nature and see how we're doing with species across taxa, animals, plants, fungi. So it wasn't, there was no ulterior motive or, you know, somebody lobbying them to do this. It's because we know about monarchs and they're a species that can be assessed.
Thank you.
Karen, do you have much more time? Can you take a few more questions?
I can take a couple more questions. I'm looking at my clock. Yep.
All
It's
right,
fun
do
for
we
me
have
to
anybody-
see the people in the audience. You look so
Hey, we got a-
wonderful, all of you.
Hey, we got a crowd here. We have about 170 people signed up for this particular event right now,
Yay.
and it's been wonderful. All right, anybody else have a question before we let Karen go? This has been terrific, Karen. I mean, you've provided a lot of very valuable background here, and I think you've cleared up things. When I saw your email message earlier, I teased everybody that this was going to be breaking news and a blockbuster because I was confused about what your message actually said. So, dumb me,
Well,
all right?
I was confused too, and that you know, I think there's the IUCN is trying to really clarify that it's this subspecies. It's the migratory monarch that's been listed. So that's really clear on the website. And if you just search for monarchs, it says they're least concern because worldwide, they don't meet those numerical criteria. The whole species of monarchs, just the subspecies.
Yeah, once my reaction to this when it originally came down was that this is the precautionary principle writ large, that basically this is an overly excessive precautionary step that they've taken. That was my interpretation because I didn't see anything that had happened in the last 10 years that would justify this particular approach. And of course, by that time, I knew that the Western population had rebounded. And of course, I know the history of these monarch populations and the weather-related things that have happened to monarchs. And you know, it's quite clear if you look at the history of this species that the population has been very, very low, and many, many times in the past, probably lower than it is now. And so this whole thing is, you know, we're in a new environment. We are in an environment that's changing very fast. I don't think there's any question about the fact that in the long run, there's an issue here. And monarchs will probably be declared endangered at some point, legitimately, in the future, because the climate is changing, the habitats are changing, the reality of protecting this species is probably going to diminish. And so that's legitimate in the distant future, but what about the proximate future? And the proximate conditions, I don't think actually warrant this decision, but that's my opinion, and I'm free to give it, even though Karen wants to be cautious, and I appreciate that too. I mean, we're going to take a hit no
Yeah.
matter what we take.
Yeah,
take
and
a
I
hit.
think it's, you know, if we think of it, it's not really an approach. It's just the science. And, you know, they have, I think that's the nice thing about the IUCN is it's not political. It's just based on their criteria for what is happening to monarchs. And, you know, Chip, I have emails from you that say there's no way we can meet these population goals. You know, there's we can't meet the habitat and the milkweed restoration goals. You know, it's not making recommendations on what we should do. It's just saying that based on these criteria, monarch numbers are declining and the threats are still there. And I think we as conservation biologists can kind of do what we will with that information. They're not telling us what to do with the information. And I think where we do agree, Chip, and everyone that's there in that room agrees that we need to do as much as we can. And this kind of gives us, you know, when we go to our local nature center or our local whatever, and say, please help monarchs, we can say they need our help, they're in trouble. And this is just based on our science. And the numbers don't, you know, they're going up and down. But if they have a big storm this year, when the numbers are very low in Mexico, if we get a storm like we did in 2002,
Right.
more recently, 2016, we'll be in trouble this year. Be better if we were at 6 hectares when we get a big storm.
You're right. We have dodged several bullets. We've had 4 killer storms down there since 2002. And in each year, the population has been robust enough to survive those massive kills. And you're right. I mean, that is the thing that I tell people that, you know, in terms of the justification, that is the real big killer in the whole system. If we have a population that goes into the winter with 0.67 hectares like we did in 2013, and we got hit with a storm that killed 80% of the butterflies, it wouldn't have taken 2 years to recover. It would have taken probably 8 or 9 years to recover. And so, you know, if you have an event like that, and that kills 80% of the butterflies in the winter and the population is small, and then you have a really warm March in Texas that sends the butterflies too far north too soon, you know, or you have a drought in the summer, or you have what we had this year, you have cold weather when the first generation butterflies should really be producing. I mean, 2 or 3 negative things in a row is what took the California population down. But they can recover. And the question that we really need to address is, what's the basis for the recovery? How long is it going to take, and what is it going to take for that population to recover? Because it's certainly been low in the past. So what I'm going to argue persistently is that, you know, this is a very, very resilient species. And, you know, went through the little ice age when the conditions were much worse than they have been in anybody's life history here. So yeah, I agree that we are dealing with entirely different landscape in terms of change in the future, but I don't think we're there yet in terms of calling this species endangered. Anyway, I think we have to let you go, and we have to move on with the rest of our talk. And we will be talking with Steve Bradbury, but he's going to talk about to list or not to list a little bit later, and maybe you can catch some of that if your meeting is a little short, Karen.
Yeah, it was really great. Thanks a lot, Chip, and congratulations, and have fun, all of you. I miss you all so much.
And we miss you too. Glad you were here. All right, Jim, who's next? Gail. Hey, come on, Gail.
this is going to be a very tough act to follow after Karen and everyone's just speaking to you. But I look forward to sharing some information about monarchs in the southwestern United States and let you know some of the data we have been collecting there. If you're not familiar with the West is actually split into 3 tagging areas. Dr. David James has the monarchs of the Pacific Northwest in the pink on the map. We used to have monarch alert in California until the monarchs were listed as threatened at the state level, and they haven't tagged for the last couple years. You heard a little bit about that already. But we actually have been approached to apply for a permit in California. We would be the first citizen science group to be approved by CDFW if this goes through, and we're in the final stages of deciding what that'll look like. And then, of course, the Southwest Monarch Study is in the blue on our map, just to give you a feel for the area. So far, we've had about 22,000 monarchs tagged in the Southwest. You can see the areas where they've been tagged. You can see some of those dots are in California of tagging areas, mainly because we traditionally have tagged into the desert areas of California because it's so similar to the desert Southwest. That stopped 2 years ago with the CDFW designation. So with that comes the recoveries, right? That's why we go out to tag to learn. In the red arrows underneath the yellow are the recoveries based on the first paper we had published in 2014 on the status of monarchs in the region. If we had stopped there, look at how much we would have missed. We're really grateful for the over 700 people who have been tagging every year. And you can see that we now, just this year, in fact, in the last couple of weeks, have had 2 recoveries from northern Utah that flew 110 miles straight south, which is really kind of exciting because up to now we have seen that Arizona has split between Mexico and California recoveries. And now we're starting to see a trend develop up in Utah too, which we were hoping we would begin to see. Those arrows there, like I mentioned, are about 110 miles. We had 1 recovery of a Utah monarch from the northern part of the state in the Phoenix area on a golf course. That stopped by a couple years ago. So we're hoping to get a recovery from that region down in Mexico someday too. So because we're so grateful to Monarch Watch and Chip and everything he's done to teach us about tagging, we took one of your more recent papers on the sun angles and peak migration for an area, superimposed them on the West, went back to our recoveries to look and see what would happen with our numbers. And so we went back to the tagging date of every recovery we had, the 78 recoveries, and placed them by sun angle. And the yellow diamonds were recovered in Mexico. The blue circles were recovered in California. And you can see how a heavy density fall within those predicted lines, some earlier and a few outliers later. We broke this same map up by states, so you can see the pattern. There's a lot of red diamonds. Arizona was the starting ground for Southwest Monarch Study and the tagging, so we have naturally more recoveries. But you can also see some in California, Nevada, and Utah. We actually went back to Utah. Those top 2 above the dotted 57-degree line were these last 2 that we superimposed on the graph. But we went back to Utah this last year and said, you know what, you're not tagging at the right time. We need you to try tagging more in this time interval. They have had an explosion this year. You heard Dr. David James talk about that, of monarchs, We have sent initially maybe 50 tags out, and now they're up to 150 per person. And I have more requests in today's mail still for more requests. So we'll see what happens as those come back. If you take them in on the day of tagging in 3-degree matchings together, averaging together, you can see what happens with the recoveries, almost following a bell-shaped curve across the area. So this is the thing of, I'm kind of learning, like when someone comes to you and you start looking at what was happening. Remember a couple years ago, everything about rearing monarch surface, and we heard John Pleasance talk about today the recovery ratio being lower in Monarch Watch tags areas. Well, we actually just found the opposite that happened with us. I remember asking for the data to be pulled with those that were reared. Before 2014, we didn't have any rearing. They were all wild monarchs. But as we expanded the tagging area and went into Utah and to New Mexico and to Nevada, more people were starting to rear. And so we were getting more reared recoveries. We actually had to add that to our data collection so we could make sure we could filter out which was which. And we were surprised to see this. I remember in 2019 when this first appeared, that the recovery of reared monarchs was actually better than wild. And so we sat on it for a couple years. I wanted to see if that held. And as you can see, these numbers are holding pretty consistently. In fact, if you tag during the time of peak migration in the Southwest, and if you tag fresh and new monarchs or freshly closed monarchs that are in just mint condition, if you reared your monarchs, you could have 1 out of 53 of those be recovered in either Mexico or California, which really surprised us because our average number now is about 1 out of 106. But again, remember, it's our top conditions. It's not conditions that are worn or tattered or the older monarchs. It's the newest ones. We kind of limited it down to that area. So that was, we're hoping to have this published in a little while. We're working on this paper right now. We also found some other interesting information. We broke them in riparian areas, urban areas, and other. And we found that urban areas actually had more recoveries than riparian, which is interesting given the papers we heard discussed earlier today. So we're finding more information, more males are recovered than females, and we'll be able to share some of that information in our future paper. We also have monarchs during the winter in the lower deserts of Arizona, Southern California, and parts of Southern Nevada. Sometimes it's a long life cycle because of the cold night temperatures. We have small numbers of clusters, and tagging during the winter months has helped us learn longevity. Even though they're staying in the same areas, we are finding monarchs that are tagged and still in the same location 3 to 4 months later, depending on when they were tagged. So tagging helps us with migration destination, but also gives us a cue as to what is happening during that winter time. You can see the chart I included for you over the last several years of how many of those monarchs were tagged during those winter months. And you can see during the 2021 year, 551, we never tagged that much during the winter months. That led the next winter to the upsurge in numbers in California. So it's an interesting timing. We can never say it's cause and effect, but we can see the numbers taking place. I'm really concerned about the numbers from this last winter, except to say those monarchs went through and migrated. They didn't stop. And that was because our temperatures were more normal, whatever that means in the lower deserts. So I want to thank you for your time. I want to thank you, Chip, for inviting us and supporting us through all these years. I want to thank Monarch Joint Venture, who helped fund our trips to the neighboring Southwest states to encourage them to tag and participate in other citizen science programs. And of course, we have our contact information. You could always reach us in any way with any questions you might have. Thank you so much.
Next up is going to be Pete Berthlesen. If you don't know Pete, you'll get a chance to meet him later this evening. Some of you will. He'll be around. He's arriving a little bit later this afternoon. Pete is an exceptional person in terms of his ability to restore habitats. And he's had a remarkable record, and he's achieved a great deal. And he's running an organization that is growing and growing and more successful at getting plants in the ground. And he's going to give us a remote talk summarizing his stuff. He knows how to talk to farmers, which is really tough. Most of us don't know how to do that. Pete knows how to do that, and it helps him succeed. All right, let's hear from Pete.
Hello, my name's Pete Berthlesen, and I'm coming to you today remotely because I'm not quite able to be there yet. I'm coming to you today from central Nebraska, the beautiful Loess Hills of central Nebraska, where I'm a farmer and a rancher. Here's a little aerial view of our spot, but at its core, what I am is a wildlife biologist that has spent my career working on designing, establishing, and managing high quality habitat like what we see in this image. So appreciate the opportunity to come here and chat with you today. And I'm kind of wearing two hats that Chip has asked me to wear today. Hat number one is my role as the executive director with a nonprofit called the Bee and Butterfly Habitat Fund. And I'll chat a little bit about that. But it's also the second hat that I wear is as president of a company called Conservation Blueprint. And Conservation Blueprint has a couple of roles. One of the things that we are is a local ecotype wildflower seed business. We live in a part of the world where we still have very high quality grasslands and work to provide access to hard to get species. We're also a wildlife consulting business where we spend lots of time designing and managing habitat. In this example, going on to a solar project that's going in the country and developing vegetation management plans and that sort of thing. So that's kind of the background and perspective that I chat with you about today. Farmer rancher, wildlife biologist, businessman, nonprofit, conservation group, seed business, that kind of a wide background. And as I come to you today, I want to, in the short amount of time that we have, I want to talk about a few foundational thoughts that I think are just critical that we need to think about when we're thinking about monarch butterfly health and habitat and conservation. And the first thought that I come to you with today is that if we try to solve monarch butterfly population concerns using the same techniques that we've been using for the last decade or two, we will fail. Everybody's familiar with this image, the index of the wintering population for the eastern monarch butterfly population, and where kind of the bare minimum is that population needs to be at. We're not doing a very good job of getting there, and it's not looking great for the future. So we really need to think about doing things differently, and that's where the Bee and Butterfly Habitat Fund takes a unique, innovative, different approach that I'll chat about a little bit more here in just a second. But one of the ways that we do that is when we work on a project, we actually design two different seed mixtures that are planted and established and managed on each project. One is very quickly establishing a seed mixture that actually contains some clover species. And the second one is 100% native, minimum of 40 wildflower species, but it's much slower to establish. So because these two seed mixtures establish very, very differently, we plant them in two separate plantings. The second foundational thought is that this is a really, really unique moment in time. And it's unique because the public has a very heightened level of understanding and concern that there are significant problems with monarch butterfly health. When you look at things like if there's a New York Times news article about monarch butterflies, or it's on CNN and things like that, we have a heightened level of understanding about it, and that creates an opportunity. This is a unique moment in time. We need to capture this moment in time where the public understands that there's a problem and that they want to do something about it. That's a unique opportunity. The next foundational thought is that when we call something pollinator habitat, everybody gets a picture in their mind of what they think pollinator habitat looks like. Usually it closely resembles the photo on the calendar in your office when you flip it to the month of July. This gorgeous flowering meadow. And we can get there and we can do those kinds of things, but we have to do it very strategically. The next foundational thought is that we don't have enough habitat on the landscape by any stretch of the imagination. So when we get an acre of habitat, we need to make it the very best that it can be. We can no longer afford to have things that are just kind of okay habitat. There's so little of it out there that we need to strive to make everything the best it can be. And towards that end, the Bee and Butterfly Habitat Fund is working on 4 different research projects that I'll talk a little bit more here about in just a second, that are evaluating the pollinator health and habitat benefits of seed mixtures. And towards that end, the next foundational thought is that not all pollinator habitat is created equal. And just because something is flowering doesn't mean that it provides great pollinator habitat value. Towards that end, here's the outcomes from just one of our research projects that was conducted by the U.S. Geological Survey, where they compared the Bee and Butterfly Habitat Fund seed mixtures to USDA conservation programs, state and federal wildlife management areas, roadsides, grass pastures, and basically it showed that in all bloom periods, the Bee and Butterfly Habitat Fund seed mixtures and the way they're designed had greater species richness, more wildflowers in it, and then things like, here's an example with native bees, about 8 times the native bee visit and use. So by really thinking about how habitat is designed, we can have a difference. The next foundational thought is that we need to bring a big tent approach to monarch butterfly conservation. Here's an example of pollinator habitat that's located next to and associated with agriculture. Personally, my view is we don't have the opportunity to be divisive and say, you are part of the problem and you can't be part of the solution. Agriculture has to be part of the solution. And for me personally, I'll take a high quality acre of pollinator habitat on the landscape wherever I can get it. And then again, the key is to make it the very best that it can be. One of the last foundational thoughts that I have here today is that we need to strive to look for combined benefits. I think one of the best examples out there lies right now in renewable energy and the opportunity to include pollinator habitat benefits associated with things like utility scale solar energy projects. And this is just one example. And one of the ways that we can think about doing that is by taking an approach that thinks about how to provide pollinator benefits both within the project and underneath the panels, where we have to really think about how tall something grows and that it can't grow taller than the lower panel height. And then also outside the area where the panels are, where we can plant a more traditional pollinator mixture. And one of the great opportunities, one of the best opportunities I think that's out there right now is an approach that we call the 2-seed mixture solution. This is an example of a real world renewable energy project, a solar project. This one happens to be located in Ohio. And these black squiggly lines in here with kind of the pink color under it are all the areas where a seed mixture has been designed to produce pollinator value that doesn't grow taller than 20 inches because the lower panel height is 24 inches off of the ground. And then these green areas here are all the areas where there aren't panels, where we had the opportunity to design and use a more traditional pollinator habitat mix where we don't have to worry about how tall it grows. This is a really unique opportunity that we can and should look at using across the country. Two last foundational thoughts. The Bee and Butterfly Habitat Fund will be announcing 2 new innovations later this year. One will be a program that we have with solar energy that will be called the Solar Synergy Program. And then later this fall, we'll actually be announcing a new program to get more milkweed plants onto the landscape with our friends at Monarch Watch, Monarch Joint Venture, and the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. And in that program, we're going to be putting and delivering more milkweed plugs to people across the country with appropriate milkweed species for their area and getting those established onto the landscape. And I close out my few minutes of time with you here today just by saying, if we think about all these foundational sort of platforms and thoughts and opportunities, they're going to join a very diverse group of interests. People that care about water quality, soil health, monarch butterflies, honeybees, grassland songbirds, food sustainability, renewable energy. All of these different interests can be uniquely brought together by what we want to do, thinking about monarch butterfly health and habitat. And that is a really unique opportunity in a really unique moment in time, when if we just think about the things that we can control related to monarch butterflies, we can control what we plant for habitat and getting more habitat on the landscape. Can't control the weather. We have a hard time controlling a lot of other things that are impacting monarch butterfly health and habitat, but this is something that we can do. And I thank you for the opportunity to chat with you today and look forward to hearing more about what others have going on. Have a great day.
There he is. There's Steve Bradbury from Iowa State University. And Steve, are you there? Can you hear us?
There we go. I had to get my mic on.
All right. Well, we're ready for you. We had Karen on earlier. Maybe you saw that presentation all about the IUCN and the confusion that's associated with their designation. And we had a long Q&A situation there with Karen answering many questions that we have about that determination and its implication for the United States. So I gather that you're going to deal with the issue with respect to what the Fish and Wildlife Service does. Is that correct?
Yeah. I don't have any great answers to the question I put on my opening slide, but hopefully provide some ideas that we can all consider as we go forward. And before I get started, Chip, I want to thank you and congratulate you on all your efforts. And I know on behalf of the ISU team, Iowa State University team, we really appreciated all the years of collaboration and visits and discussions of Big 12 basketball and KU and Iowa State games.
it helped the students a lot, and we really appreciated it. So I want to spend a few minutes giving you some background on the Endangered Species Act and implications if the monarch is or isn't listed as an endangered or threatened species. And as I go through this talk, I'll try to illustrate how the interplay of statutes, laws, policy, science, and the human dimension can influence the advancement of monarch conservation. So you've seen a slide that Wendy had that's similar to this one, where it tracks the beginning of the ESA process back in August of 2014 with the petition to list received by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. December 2014, Fish and Wildlife Service agrees that the petition has standing. In other words, it has a strong scientific foundation. By statute, in December of 2015, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service should have issued a status review, but they didn't. And that's no knock on U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. They got more to do than they've got people that can do it. So then in January 2016, petitioners filed a notice of intent to sue the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for unreasonable delay. And in March 2016, they filed their unreasonable delay suit. The Fish and Wildlife Service and the petitioners then negotiated December 2020 as the date in which they would issue their decision. And in the 2020 decision, they determined that the listing as a threatened or endangered species was warranted under the Endangered Species Act. However, the service precluded immediate implementation of its decision due to higher priority actions for other listed species. And they also indicated in their determination that in 2024, they would propose the monarch for protection under the ESA. So in other words, they'd reevaluate the situation. In that 2020 finding, Fish and Wildlife Service identified 3 threats to recovery, and they included loss of habitat, climate change, and pesticide exposure. So as you can see, takes some time to go through this process, but that's a outcome of a deliberate democracy. It takes time to go through the processes that are laid down in our laws. We also have voluntary programs going on, and Wendy and others gave great overview of the various voluntary consensus building activities, but they also take time to build up the momentum and the cohesion to have an impact at a national scale. So a part of that decision to determine or to come up with that candidate designation certainly included the aspect of other species at greater risk and requiring the more immediate attention of the Fish and Wildlife Service. But there was another factor that played into that decision, and that was the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's evaluation of existing conservation efforts. And so as a combination of them documenting that the voluntary conservation efforts were likely to be implemented in the coming years, and that those conservation efforts were likely to be effective in the future because they were based on the best available science at the time and could move forward. So they were citing MAFWA's strategy, the rights of way effort, and they could use that information combined with their workload and the status of risk to come up with that candidate species designation. And that bought everybody some time to continue advancing those conservation efforts, which will be a big part, I believe, in the analysis Fish and Wildlife Service will undertake in 2024. In other words, what they're faced with is, do they go ahead and issue a rule to designate the monarch as a threatened or endangered species, or do they decide to continue with the candidate species designation? And so how efficiently and effectively these voluntary conservation efforts can have an impact plays a big role in where the Fish and Wildlife Service will end up in their decision. We also heard this morning and after the lunch break that conservation in agricultural dominated landscapes is going to be really critical to reaching our habitat establishment goals. If we take a look at the state of Iowa, about 93% of the land is agriculturally dominated, and about 97% of the land is privately owned. And these kind of numbers would probably a little bit lower across the upper Midwest would be similar. So we've got a lot of agriculture and we've got a lot of land that's privately owned. This sort of creates a unique challenge under the Endangered Species Act, which typically hasn't had to deal with species that cover dozens and dozens of states, nor have the services had to deal with endangered species issues where the majority of the land classes, land cover, is privately owned. Like out west, where they're dealing with lots of places they've got to deal with for species, a lot of the land that's in place is federally owned land. So they have a lot of leverage working with other federal agencies to implement conservation measures. This will be a different challenge for the Fish and Wildlife Service if they decide to go ahead and list it, because it's going to be how to engage private landowners into advancing conservation practices. So if we zoom in a bit from that previous slide and take a look at what it looks like on the ground and some of the pictures that Pete showed just a few minutes ago, a lot of the habitat's going to get established in close proximity to row crop fields. So if we take a look at this scene or other kinds of scenes, there's clearly several ecological and agronomic goods and services in play within this landscape. And not surprisingly, there are diversity of stakeholders that are either directly working in these landscapes or indirectly influencing what's happening in these landscapes with the goal of optimizing agronomic practices as well as optimizing conservation practices. So going forward, this kind of setting creates sort of another way of laying out the two questions. One would be, can we produce crops and practice effective voluntary monarch conservation? Or do we need federal regulations to produce the crops and effectively conserve monarchs? So a high level kind of set of questions. And of course, there's all sorts of sub questions within those questions. So let me run through some of the what ifs if the monarch was listed and how that kind of interplays with voluntary conservation efforts. So under the Endangered Species Act, federal agency actions have to be compliant with the Act, with the Endangered Species Act. So in the context of the US Department of Agriculture, implementations of the Farm Bill programs are agency actions that have to be compliant with the Endangered Species Act. So in that context, FSA and NRCS have or are consulting with the US Fish and Wildlife Service to ensure actions undertaken through, say, the CRP program or the EQIP program adequately protect the monarch if it's listed. And so some of these practices are designed explicitly to enhance monarch conservation, and the agreements between USDA and the Fish and Wildlife Service specify certain practices landowners should use to try to minimize any harm or take of monarchs as they establish the new habitat that's designed for monarchs or pollinators or songbirds and monarchs. But there's also requirements in these agreements that if there are conservation efforts ongoing, they don't have anything to do with monarchs, say they're due to water quality, establishing restored wetlands, establishing saturated buffers, establishing bioreactors where there's a lot of equipment moving on the farm. There are also recommendations, requirements that those landowners need to undertake to minimize take while they're installing, say, their water quality technology. So a lot of details and a lot of best management practices folks have to follow. And so a question to think about, would listing, do you think, encourage more landowners to enroll in Farm Bill programs that support monarch conservation or not? I don't know the answer, but there's some factors these landowners are going to take into account. And also another question is, does the budget for the Farm Bill programs, is it even sufficient to cover all the acres if a lot of landowners wanted to get into these programs? So if it's listed, we also have to think to this scenario for non-federal landowners who aren't enrolled in the Farm Bill program. because they also need to be compliant with the Endangered Species Act if the monarch was listed. So some of the work we did with the Iowa Monarch Conservation Consortium, working with Fish and Wildlife Service, we came up with a decision tree of what a landowner would need to be considering, assuming they're not covered under the Farm Bill, as to whether or not they need to ask the Fish and Wildlife Service for an incidental take permit, which means, what do I need to do to allow me to execute a land cover, a land activity that may cause harm to individual monarchs? And it's possible that that landscape activity may have no impact on monarchs or milkweed, and then go ahead with the activity. Or it could be that, yeah, while I'm installing that bioreactor or doing some kind of management, mowing parts of my land, I know there's monarch habitat out there, and that activity could perhaps harm the monarch. Well, maybe I can just plan that activity before the monarchs get here in the spring or after they've left in the fall, and then I probably don't need to approach Fish and Wildlife Service. But if I can't use time to my advantage to avoid potential take, I'm probably going to need to touch base with Fish and Wildlife Service and get some input as to whether or not I should be requesting an incidental take permit. My sense is, at the end of the day, there's probably not going to be a lot of compliance issues that farmers are going to face in this scenario, but there are significant transaction costs, time, money, goodwill in dealing with the potential need for incidental take permits. So I think one of the issues to be worked out over the coming year is, to what extent, what's the cost benefit ratio for monarch conservation under a listing scenario compared to the cost benefit ratio under a voluntary conservation program. That kind of cost benefit ratio analysis has yet to be done. But again, the goal, regardless of the process, listing or not listing, is to reach those goals that we've all talked about in terms of 1.3 billion stems in the upper Midwest and getting back up to a 20-year average of 6 hectares of occupied forest in Mexico. Now, USDA isn't the only federal agency that has to ensure they're compliant with the Endangered Species Act. EPA's Office of Pesticide Programs, which is responsible for pesticide regulations, also has to make sure their pesticide-specific regulations are compliant with the Endangered Species Act. And I would say this is probably the biggest challenge we'll all face if the listing goes forward, because of the complexity around pesticide regulations. If we go back to those pictures of habitat adjoining row crop production, we're going to have an interface of pesticide use and the habitat and what's going to happen to the monarchs. So pesticide-specific regulations are actions that have to be consulted with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And it's possible that through these consultations, additional risk mitigation measures would be required on the pesticide labels. And having said that, farmers and applicators that follow those new pesticide label requirements would have regulatory assurance for any take. So there's a way forward, but the challenge is how to go through this process. EPA's lack of compliance with the endangered species is an ongoing 30+ year challenge. And part of that challenge is that there's thousands of listed species. There are hundreds of pesticides. It's a computational explosion in terms of the complexity, the kind of risk assessments that are needed to help support sound consultations and recommendations. EPA is under court-ordered deadlines for consultations because of this delay. And so it's a really, unfortunately, perfect storm that's brewing, I think, if there's a listing and how this is going to work out with pesticide regulations. Another complexity is there isn't a lot of toxicity data for monarch life stations or milkweed for insecticides, herbicides, and fungicides. So if we just take a look at an Iowa scenario in the corn and soybean belt, just taking a look at that production, we've got dozens and dozens of pesticides that could be in play and would require consultation to be, and that those decisions to be integrated in soybean and corn production. So in this figure, you can see when corn planting starts in mid-April, and then soybean planting taking out into late May with some overlap between the two crops. Most of those crops are being planted with seeds that have been treated with insecticides or fungicides. There's also herbicide applications going on. Mid-April, the first over-the-top herbicide application typically occurs. In mid-June, typically the second over-the-top application. Could be applying insecticides in mid-May to early June for true armyworms that could be involved and are kind of increasing their pressure on crop fields, especially those fields planted with cover crops as a water quality management technique. Late May to late July, neonicotinoids coming off of treated seeds are detected in milkweed. So we've got an exposure pathway during that period of time. And then in late July, early August, applications of insecticides and control the soybean aphid. And many times those applications include fungicides in a tank mix. So just taking a peek at what would be going on in Iowa, there's probably a dozen to 2 dozen pesticides that would need to be evaluated to determine their use and ensuring compliance with the Endangered Species Act. So think about similar settings across the Midwest, which may have different cropping patterns. Same thing in the Southern Plains. Think about the Central Valley, California, and you get a sense of the complexity of these consultations. So as we talked about this morning, the monarchs are a vagile species and they move across the landscape. And so some of the research we've been doing at Iowa State is trying to figure out how we can try to quantify the potential adverse effects of pesticide use, at least in the north central states, realizing the monarchs are agile species. And what that means is it requires a landscape scale analysis because that female is moving all across the landscape, laying eggs as she moves across the landscape. It's an open population and the whole population dynamics is linked to that agile nature. So over the years, we've been doing research in toxicology to come up with information for representative insecticides. We've been applying the agent-based model that Kelsey mentioned this morning and looking at what would be the likelihood of adverse effects under different habitat scenarios with different patterns of insecticide exposure. At least with this approach we're starting to advance, the risk may not be as big as it seems. There'll be risk to individual monarchs, but assuming we're getting habitat into the ground, as Pete described, that habitat establishment dwarfs the impact of pesticide use. But this took us about 5 or 6 years of graduate student research, postdoc research to work through these analyses. So the question is, how can the Fish and Wildlife Service and EPA move forward on techniques like this or other techniques to inform those characterizations? Having said that, integrated pest management and spray drift management are critical. Our modeling shows that maximizes monarch production. And so don't have to be a rocket scientist to realize we need to really advance outreach and support for getting IPM and spray drift management maximized in agronomic crop efforts. So we've got some data gaps to fill, and we need to be thinking about how to fill gaps that allow us to do population analyses at the landscape scale. So in wrapping up my talk, sort of this question still out there. How do we efficiently and effectively advance conservation efforts, realizing we've got a lot of activities going on in these agricultural landscapes? And how are EPA and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service going to be able to manage this with support from all sorts of organizations that are working on these issues? And to be fair, EPA and Fish and Wildlife Service are exploring some innovations in how to improve the consultation practice for pesticides. So for example, they're exploring how compensatory mitigation measures like planting habitat in the landscape can be used as an offset for take that may be associated with exposure to pesticides. They're also trying to take a look at techniques similar to what we've been describing or building from some of the techniques us and others have been proposing to try to refine spatial and temporal aspects of the consultations so that they can have a more focused risk mitigation process. But it's going to take time for these innovations to go online. So perhaps maintaining the monarch as a candidate species, if the data supports that, could help provide the possibility of and give time for these voluntary conservation efforts to progress, and perhaps provide in the near term a more efficient and effective path forward to support monarch conservation. It's also possible if it maintains a candidate listing and we can explore and advance some of these innovations, this monarch effort could serve as a test bed for Fish and Wildlife Service and EPA to see how some of the approaches that can be advanced through voluntary efforts could be used to further advance species conservation science and practices, as well as the art of building collaborative partnerships for other species in other locations in the country. So hopefully I didn't run too long. And again, Chip, thanks a lot for all your efforts over the years and the invitation to speak.
Well, thank you, Steve. We are running long, and we do intend to getting people out of here, but we have an opportunity to talk to a person with a great deal of knowledge, working knowledge of what's going on the ground with respect to these issues. And we have a few minutes for questions, but I want to get you out of here because we have other things to do this afternoon. All right, does anybody have a question for Steve?
I have some questions. As an ecologist, I often think about source and sink habitats for monarchs in agricultural landscapes. Is there much data that supports what you kind of talked about as the offset of productivity that's lost in sort of like the prairie strips? Is there data to say that the herbicide applications aren't affecting the actual productivity that could be generated from those strips?
Right. So for strips or habitat next door to a corn or soybean field, the monarch is a vaginal species. It's populations that have an open structure, and that's been documented in numerous papers. So the concept of a metapopulation in sources and sinks doesn't apply to the monarch. And that's because the females are moving all across the landscape. If a female came to the first patch when she gets up to Iowa or Illinois, whatever, and then stayed there in that patch for her entire lifespan, then we could have entertained the source sink discussion, but it doesn't apply to the monarch. So other butterflies, it could be enclosed population structure, metapopulations. Our conclusions could be different. As to the extent habitat improvement offsets insecticide exposure. With regard to the herbicide use, so far the research we've done here, Bob Hartzler, and research done by other groups, and then probably not inconsistent with milkweed previously being a pest in these fields. It can take a knock from a herbicide, get knocked off its feet for, if you will, for a handful of days and week maybe, and it recovers. So the herbicides that are being used today and the exposures that are likely are unlikely to cause long-term impacts on the milkweed plant itself. But certainly there are data gaps to be filled.
Any other questions for Steve? Yes.
Yeah, as a person who has been involved in production agriculture over the years, and conservation both, I will say this symposium has been, and even last night was, farmers are basically welcome into this realm, which I got to say that's a first that I've heard in a long time in these fields. But one of the things I've, being involved in different farm bills, conservation programs, and one of the things I've noticed is that there needs to be some economic carrots hung out there for the farmer to do some of these practices. Granted, there are farmers that are going to do this just because they want to protect the monarchs or, increase habitat for other species. But there's some out there who will highly resist doing anything unless there is a benefit economically for them. Is there been any discussion as to what that cost would be to do that for the farmer?
Yeah, so good question. So a couple of threads of thought. CRP, as you know, the producer is getting payments every year for the cropland that went out of production. That can be one source of defraying the costs, if you will. Say under EQIP, different farm bill program, getting 50% of the establishment cost covered, but no yearly payment. So those are definitely issues that need to be considered. Farmers that are willing to, at least in Iowa, the farmers we're talking to share some of the same points you're raising, that they may not expect to have, and certainly don't expect to have 100% of the costs covered by the federal government, but at a minimum, getting some support to defray at least the startup costs, the first 3 or 4 years of maintenance would help a lot. So I think that's an important issue. And society as a whole has we're all benefiting from what's going on in that conservation effort, even if we're not in those fields. I think that's a fair point. I think that with the advent of digital agriculture, and as farmers start moving from yield as a measure of success to profit as a measure of success, by identifying parts of their fields that are unproductive, I think that can be an important part of this economic analysis. Again, maybe with some support, but realizing they're going to gain higher profits by starting to ease back on trying to grow corn or soybeans, for example, in parts of the field that are never productive. So stop planting where you're losing money. Could be another feature to providing that economic support.
Well, thank you, Steve. I think with that, we need to close things up here. And thank you very much for participating in this. And thank you all for attending. I just have a couple of more comments on this particular point. A couple of things that neither Karen nor Steve mentioned. One of which is the resistance to regulation. I live in the country. I talk to a lot of people in the country. They are very resistant to regulation. So that's going to be a factor going forward with anything that comes out of the ESA. Another thing is politics. And we know that, right? We know that politics could interfere with these sorts of things because whoever controls the Congress controls the money. And there are differences in perception about what's really important between the two parties. And I'm not going to go any further than that. You've got imaginations. You can think this through. All right. So anyway, I think that's the biggest problem that I see with all of this is that the decisions will not be made on the basis of science alone. Everything else is going to come into play. All right. Well, thank you all, and I appreciate you all coming. This is just terrific.